There is a brand new one drop that will always have a slide. Upgraded elite vanguard with bows to oh my so high. A windmill include for me. It's clear for everyone to see. Ooh, spirit.
Come on.
You will always be my two.
I know about y'all, but I know about us.
Two.
I'll decide whether the boost based on blocks. I don't know about y'all, but I know about us.
One.
I'll decide whether the boost based on blocks.
You remember, girl, I was the one who curved out every game. Cause I remember, girl, the sight of you making my opponents proclaim. Every turn one, you come down and start putting the pressure on. Girl, I was there, and you were my spirit. Started in the spoiler season, you were my 2-1. You swung in and made some tokens and the relevant types. My 2-1. No, the upgrade isn't strict, but it's alright. My 2-1. I know there's other options just in white, but you will always be my started in spoiler season, you were my 2-1. You swung in and made some tokens and the relevant types. My 2-1. No, the upgrade isn't strict, but it's alright. My 2-1. I know there's other options just in white, but you will always be my 2, my 2, my 2, my 2-1, my 2, my 2, my 2, my 2, my 2-1, my 2.
I don't know about y'all, but I know about us.
My 2-1.
I'll decide whether the boost based on blocks.
My
I don't know about y'all, but I know about us. I love when you boast like that, baby. Yeah. Spoiler season. Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, blaming the arena shuffler Maddox. Anthony, is this true?
Yeah, guilty.
You've stooped to one of the lowest kinds of Magic content posters, blaming the arena shuffler.
It doesn't happen when I play in paper.
Look, I am giving you a hard time, but also I understand why it's frustrating because it's a computer program, so you don't know what's going on in there, right? I mean, they tell you they're shuffling
Sure.
it, but do you
really
know?
do know. Computer programs are just horrible mysteries. I think my favorite Arena Shuffler blame post was in an actual bug report on Arena. Somebody said, this never happens to me in paper. I just shuffle my lands and shuffle my spells together, and then just kind of weave them together a little bit, and I never get mana screwed.
Yeah, they were like, it's a great strategy. You put spell land, spell land.
Yeah, why don't more people do this?
Everyone should do that. We've never talked about this, Anthony. What do you think of the Arena hand smoothing algorithm?
It makes a lot of sense. Like, it's been interesting. I've been thinking about Arena a lot the last couple days, and the fact that it is a really great implementation of Magic, but it just sort of makes me realize that I'm not really a video game player. The losses in Arena just feel so bad, especially the losses where it's just like, oh, I got mana screwed and didn't play a game. It's just not the same as when
you're not a gamer.
I'm not a gamer. That's it. I'm just a
if
Magic player.
Well, this is not an Arena podcast, Anthony. This is a podcast where we talk about mostly Cube, and this is our Kaldheim set review, which, of course, means that we are not alone. There is a third voice on this call. We are also joined by Jett, Sultan of Statistics Crowdis. Hi, Jett.
Sultan of Statistics?
Yeah, how's that? Is that all right for you? Does that work for you?
It's a little pompous for me.
See, the thing is, me and Anthony have been friends for like 15 years. You and I, we don't go quite so far back, so I don't feel as comfortable making up insulting nicknames for you as I do Anthony.
Oh, I see.
I feel like my nickname space has been diluted a little bit. Usually I'm the one that gets the nickname.
So far, I think Daniel still has the record for most nicknames, even though he's only been on one show. I've given you one every show, but that one episode, I think I gave Daniel like 20 or 30.
Well, he deserves it. That's a special exception.
Daniel's a very nickname-worthy man. Anyway, thanks for joining us, Jett. We're excited to kind of go through all of the results of our latest survey, which once again is crushing previous records. We keep outdoing ourselves every set. How many responses did we end up getting in total for this?
in total we have 248 responses.
That's great. Would
split
you
by
have thought
different cube
we'd have
types.
been here just after like a year, basically? I mean, we've been doing the surveys now for, I guess, a little over a year and a half-ish. And we went from like 30 responses on our first survey to like 250 some here, which is pretty great.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Like the first survey was just sort of me messaging random people I knew on various Cube platforms, and now we had this beautiful website that I designed myself, and then people
You designed
fill
and built.
Yeah.
We put the survey out, and then when it gets towards the end of the survey, you'll just start messaging people directly. And this always seemed like a very, very manual process to me. Did you end up actually bugging anybody specifically this time around?
Oh yeah, I have a hit list, so to speak. So if someone fills out a previous survey and then doesn't fill out this one, I track them down. I only do that for one survey though. If people continue to not respond, I stop bugging them.
I don't know if
Do you
you
do it for
can
people you,
say
like,
that.
don't
That might
know,
have
too?
some privacy concerns.
Yeah, it might, but like I only bug them if I know they're active on Discord communities.
These
mostly.
are people you know. This isn't. You're not signing up for a newsletter by submitting the survey. Just to be clear.
Yeah. No, in like the internet stranger sense.
Yeah. Also, to be clear, we publish all the information from the survey, so I don't think it's a privacy concern. This is a public information. We're making it public.
Fair enough. But yeah, I mean, I was shocked when we got over 100 a couple surveys ago. It's like, wow, we are like in the niche of the niche of the niche community here, and this many people are submitting was really exciting. So thank you to everybody for submitting and participating in this.
Yeah, I feel like we've gotten a better and better picture of what the like full breadth of the Cube community, or at least more the full breadth of the Cube community, actually looks like. And it's only possible because people are graciously filling out their survey for us. So yes, thank you to everybody that did it. We have a lot to discuss on this episode. So once again, no pack one, pick one. I feel bad because I didn't think about the fact that we were doing the review show last week, when I was like, oh, let's just skip the pack one, pick one because we have a deep topic. So now we're back-to-back weeks with no pack one, pick one. But I swear we are coming back to it. So keep sending those cube lists in, mail at luckypaper.co, include your name, pronouns, etc. And we will do listener-submitted cube pack one, pick ones in the future. But we got a long list here, and we got places to be. We can't be podcasting all day, so I think we should just dig in. Does that make sense to you all?
Yeah, I think maybe we should start by explaining the survey in brief for people that haven't listened to the last one.
Take it away, Jett.
So essentially, what we do is we send out this survey to various parts of the Cube community. That includes the various Discord servers that are focused on Cube, the MTG Salvation forums, Riptide Labs, different places like that. And
all the little islands, the little Cube islands.
Yeah. And then each user will essentially provide a list of cards that they are testing in their cubes, and then they will rank those cards on a scale of 1 to 3, with 1 being, I think this card will probably not last very long in my cube. It's sort of a fringe playable that I'm just testing. 2 being, I'm not sure about this card. It might do well and it might not do well. I'm testing to sort of check. And then 3 being, I think this is a windmill slam in my cube and will be a staple in my cube for years to come. And I think notably, those ratings often correlate with power level because many of our respondents are interested in maximizing power level in their cubes, but not always, because there might be a case where someone with a medium power cube takes a look at some really high powered card and actually gives it a fairly low rating because it might be too powerful for their cube. And so they might actually leave it out once they test and see that it's too strong.
Yeah, we're talking about stuff like Oko is a card that didn't get super high responses, I think. Partially because people maybe didn't know it was good, but also I think partially because some people knew it was really good and just didn't want a card that powerful in their environment. A similar thing that happens is a card might be very powerful, but just have an effect or ability people don't like. For example, some people just don't play double-face cards in their cube, and so it doesn't matter how good the card is, doesn't matter how power-optimized the cube is, they're not going to play that card ever anyway.
Yeah, and this time we also added just an additional open-ended comments field, and it was really interesting to read through those, and sort of, it gave a lot of color to the responses. Like you said, a lot of people mentioned that they were just not testing double-face cards, or specifically had included them, but rated them fairly low because they don't expect them to be, worth that complexity of the double-face card.
Yeah, and so for each of the cards we're going to talk about, we have the number of people that are testing the cards, and so popular cards will have a lot of people testing them, and then sort of an average rating that each card has. And sort of the breakdown amongst different cube types is we have a little over 200 cubes that we sort of designate as unrestricted, meaning they're not restricted by rarity. And so this includes the, traditional unpowered, legacy powered cube style, but then also a number of themed cubes, like we have some respondents that have cubes like a one-drop cube or an alliteration cube. And so those are various themes, but they're not restricted by rarity. And so we sort of put an arbitrary boundary on them just for the sake of doing data analysis. And then we have 31 designers that have peasant cubes and then 10 pauper designers that responded to the survey.
And Anthony, remind us what peasant and pauper are.
One of them is commons and uncommons. The other one is just commons. Which one is
And
which?
which one
I don't
is
know.
it?
They're just synonyms.
Peasant is, of course, uncommons and commons, and pauper is commons only. And those are self-identified for the respondents. So some of those people I know, for example, run rare mana fixing in their cubes, even though they are otherwise a peasant cube. But they still identify as a peasant cube, and so that works for us. Yeah, unrestricted, like you were saying, Jett, is a very big tent. There's a lot of cubes that fall under unrestricted. Anything that's not rarity restricted falls under there. So, I myself have 3 cubes now that I consider lists I keep up to date. Like my main cube, the degenerate micro cube, and I also have a combat trick cube I've been playing around with. And so all of those cubes I put responses in for, and they all fall under unrestricted, despite how different those different lists are.
Yeah, I mean, that's important to keep in mind is that, like we always say, Cube is not one format. There's a lot of context that goes into it. So I think that the real value here is this visualization we're creating and this article about what cards people are testing can be a great discovery tool and a tool to sort of get a sense of what people are playing. It doesn't need to say, this card is objectively better or worse than another card.
Absolutely. That is not what we are trying to do at all.
Maybe one other little piece of information that we included in this survey that I think is relevant. We asked people whether or not they are cubing snow basics.
Good
Because
point,
I think there are different ways to include snow in their cubes. And so we had a little comment that said, how are you including snow in your cube, if at all? And so some brief results from that. About 55 people out of the 250 people that responded are actually have the sort of design, principle that all of their basics are snow, which I thought was actually really interesting.
That surprised me too. That's way more than I expected. That's like 20% of our respondents that are playing snow basics in their cube, which I think I would have guessed somewhere between like 5 and 10% if you had asked me to guess before we're seeing those results.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising. I know I personally made the switch to snow basics just because I love Icefang Quaddle and Arkham's Astrolabe and all of those fun effects. But I think a lot of people, at least from my online impressions on the community, sort of dislike that approach. And so I was kind of surprised to see it be so high.
Yeah, I'm guessing most of the people that do run Snow Basics switch with Modern Horizons because that really gave you strong motivations to play Snow Basics. And maybe there's some more that were converted exactly by this set that didn't do it for Modern Horizons, but have done it now for specific cards. But yeah, either way, that's a big chunk, and it does certainly put some context on the overall numbers of testers for each of these cards, given that there are a fair number of cards that care about snow in this set.
Yeah, definitely. There are some cards that are only being tested by players that are cubing Snow Basics, and then some cards that the ratings of the cards might vary between people that are cubing snow and people that are not.
So, for a little more context, have you played with any of these cards yet, Jett, yourself?
I have, yeah. So I cube sort of every weekend with my my IRL / now online play group. I've gotten some testing results. I mean, I think the ones I've gotten are pretty straightforward, and I'll talk about them as they come up. But definitely still a lot to be discovered in that space for us.
Yeah, we did, with my same situation, we have our local play group that is all digital and online now, of course, and we drafted my cube with the Kaldheim cards added in this past Wednesday, and I actually took a little tip from a friend of the show, Zolthux, who his sort of approach to testing cards from a new set is just to let people draft normal decks from the cube and then add in any of the cards from the testing list that they want to put in their list, which I thought was an interesting approach. I mean, we did try that. So basically we had a full 8 for this draft. And then I had a list of, I think, like 12 or 15 cards that I was considering testing in the cube. And I was like, if you want to play any of these cards, just put them in, which it highlights a lot of things, right? Like, obviously it lets you test cards kind of under the best case scenario, right? Like you get to draft a deck, and then if the card's good for your deck, you put it in. You don't have to worry about like getting a first pick card from Kaldheim and trying to draft around it or something, which is kind of nice. It also, I think, is telling to offer up all these cards for literal free and have some players still not take any of them. Some of the cards did not get put in anybody's deck at all, which I think is a pretty strong condemnation of that card's viability in my environment. If when the opportunity was presented to have it for free, nobody wanted it, it says a lot, I think.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. I might have to try that. We've sort of just been putting them in the draft pool, but then sometimes, you like see them in the middle of a pack and there's just like a blatantly more powerful card for your deck, and then you're kind of obligated to take that instead of the spice
Which also tells you something. Like, if you are put it in your actual cube list and you're drafting it as normal and you find yourself never taking any of the cards because there's always a better card for your deck in the pack, then that is another piece of data that would not be caught by the other method of testing, right? Like, some of these cards could be perfectly fine and playable if you get them for free at the end, but you would never actually draft them, and you might not learn that by Zolflix's testing method.
Yeah.
This brings us to our very first hot take. Zolflix did send in a clip, which I'll insert here.
Zolflix's hot take.
My hot take is simple. Playtest. Either proxy the card when it's previewed and play with a friend, or go online through a third-party program and get some reps in. You don't have to do a full 8-person draft. You can just seed that into your draft or even sealed cube pool and just get some reps with it. Just playtest. That's really, experience is the best way to know how something is going to work.
I get the vibe from Zol that he feels like people have too many opinions without actually playtesting a card, because playtesting is the best way to get a good sense of how it performs. And, overall, like, I kind of agree. Like, I think playtesting cards only gives you more information. There's no harm that can come from it. But I also think that playtesting cards can give you bad information too. Magic is a complicated game with a lot of variance. I think if you playtest a card and think that's how you're going to learn how good it is, then you might just have the experience of it underperforming or overperforming because of variance. And if you overly inform your evaluation of the card on that, then you're also kind of being a little bit misguided. So I think it's a balance of using your kind of big high picture theory card evaluation skills and informing that with raw data from playing the card. How does it feel to play? And did it feel unbeatable? Did it feel good to draw? Those kinds of pieces of information. But I don't think being results oriented is the best way to go about testing these cards.
I mean, I think for me, more important is just to qualify that and say, if you're going to try and present objective facts about the power level of a card, actually backing that up with some experience is going to make your argument a lot stronger. I don't think there's space to say, like, if you're not doing this kind of playtesting, then you're playing Magic wrong. Like, that's not what we're here for.
My other point is that I think if you're playtesting properly, it should furnish you with a very good explanation for why a card is good. And you shouldn't have to rely on the fact that, well, I playtested it and it was good, so just trust me, right?
Right, yeah.
The point of playtesting a card is to form a robust evaluation that you can defend absent the fact that it was playtested. You can actually explain why it's good. Really, like, all card evaluation comes down to, in what circumstances is this card good and bad, and at what ratio do those good and bad circumstances come up over the course of an average game or match of Magic. And I think being able to explain that is the real value. And so I think Zolfix would agree with us on that. You shouldn't just fall back on, well, I've playtested it, and it was good, so that's all. It counts. That's all I have to say to convince you this card is powerful. You should, in fact, actually have a much better explanation for why it's good if you are playtesting a card and doing your due diligence.
For sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think another sort of tricky thing to deal with here is that different cubes have different contexts, right? A card might perform really well in certain cubes through playtesting, and it turns out that that sort of playtesting experience isn't as translatable as we would maybe like it to be. I think, like, for example, Clarion Spirit from this set is a really good example, and I think the strength of that card depends a lot on sort of the efficiency and streamlinedness, in some sense, of your cube.
Right, and I think that's part of what Andy's saying, is that when you actually have an explanation, not only is your actual argument more robust, it also does make it more translatable, because you can say, well, this is powerful in this context because of ABC, and then you can say, well, actually, only one of those really applies in my particular cube, so it's going to be a lot less powerful.
Totally agreed.
Yeah, and I think overall this sort of style of playtesting worked a lot better than I expected. I was a little bit concerned everybody would kind of end up in the same colors. Like, I was going into it saying, like, well, I basically already have a dozen cards in my draft pool. I can now just take fixing extremely highly and, like, really warp my draft around it, which maybe happened a little bit. I think maybe other people were a little bit more in the spirit of it than I was. But just in retrospect, it really felt like we did just have a lot of experience with these cards, so I think that worked out pretty well.
Yeah, and one factor of that in this particular example is that, spoiler alert, I had a lot more cards I was testing in specific colors than other colors.
Right, yeah.
So I think if it had happened to have been pretty spread evenly across the covers, or very roughly so, then there wouldn't be that motivation. But I was testing a lot of white cards and like one red card and no green cards, I think. So
yeah,
certainly there was like a big pool to be drafting a certain type of deck because you got all those free cards. But yeah, I agree. I liked it. I'm going to do it again in the future, I think, with other sets. I also... I like doing that for the first round of testing because I also don't want to make cuts for my cube. And I know Anthony will say I put them in and, and just let the
Follow
cube be
your
bigger.
heart.
But I want to play with all of them too, right? So see, I don't like making cuts before I really feel like I've gotten a little bit of a grasp of the cards, and I think this will help give me enough opinions to figure out some cuts when putting new cards in. So I like this
makes a lot of
approach.
sense.
Thank you, Zolthix, for the tip. I will be doing it in the future.
Yeah, it's a good idea. We'll probably try that in the future too.
And you are not alone in testing a lot of white cards, are you?
I am not. We've set the table now for 18 minutes. Let's go ahead and dive in with white, top of the color pie, and the top card with a bullet, number 1, was of course Usher of the Fallen. This was tested by 150 of our respondents, which is a pretty big percentage, and had a 2.8 rating, which I see here in your notes, Jett. Only 3 cards have ever ranked higher, which were Questing Beast, Bone Crusher Giant, and Murderous Rider. But I will add to that those cards were from a survey that we had far, far, far fewer respondents to, and I would guess that if we had 200 some respondents to the Eldraine survey, that all those cards would have ranked lower than Usher of the Fallen.
Yeah, I agree.
The more respondents we get, the harder it's going to be for a card to get close to 3, because there's just that many more people and that many more chances for somebody to rate it low and kind of throw off that average. So this is, I think, going to be the top card in terms of overall rating and number of responses we will have on these surveys for some time. I think this card is pretty clearly beloved by most people.
Yeah, I mean, why do you think that is?
Well, I think one big contributing factor is that it's an uncommon. So there are a lot of cubes that can play it, obviously, more than if it was a rare or mythic. It's also very simple. There's not really anything about this card to be upset about in the terms of like double-sided cards that people don't like. A lot of people don't like cards that have a bunch of additive distraction flavor text, where it's text that doesn't really matter. This card's very clean, it's very elegant, and it just slots into a kind of card that a lot of people are already including in their cubes, which is white, 1 mana, 2/1s, and is strictly better than a lot of cards other people are already playing. So it's a known quantity. Like, people know that they play end like Sky Marcher Aspirant, or they play in like Mardu Woe Reaper, and they look at this and say, well, this is pretty clearly an upgrade of both those cards. And so there's not a lot of unknowns about this card, I think, and that's why I think it rated so highly.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. It's not like, oh, here's a cool, interesting build around. Do I want to try and support this new archetype or warp my cube around it? It's just like, yep, I'm already playing 6 of these cards. There's either room just to expand this to make the white aggro deck more effective, or just, have a strict upgrade over one of these other cards.
Yeah, I also think the fact that it makes tokens has a lot of people interested as well, and probably in lower powered environments, because, it's a kind of card that slots you into a bunch of different archetypes, whether that's aggressive white decks or some more token-based or aristocrat synergies that people enjoy playing.
That's true. I did actually think about that, but there are people that have a more sort of micro-archetype design approach to their cube, and they're like, well, green-white is tokens, and white-black is aristocrats, and even if you don't support all Elite Vanguard, super high-density one-drop white aggro, this still slots into your cube regardless because of those reasons. So I think that's all the reasons why it's kind of a slam dunk. I do have a question about this card. I said there's not that many unknowns about it. I saw Ben Stark ask this question on Twitter in relationship to Kaldheim Limited, but I was curious what your answers would be for your respective cube environments or any cube you play this card in. If you play Usher of the Fallen on turn 1 on the play, your opponent then, plays a land and does nothing else and passes back to you. Your turn 2, you attack with Usher of the Fallen. Do you boast, or do you play a 2-drop from your hand under most circumstances, do you think?
It's hard because I think the answer is it depends on what your current hand looks like and what your opponent's hand looks like. If I had
Let's
to
assume
guess,
you don't know your opponent's hand and you do have a good 2-drop in your hand.
Okay,
Or
I'm
if you
playing against a
prefer, I would say you
goldfish.
have 2 more good 1-drops in your hand and you can double spell.
But just with the speed of my cube environment, I think you can't really take off that turn to get the spirit, because a lot of decks will just race you and sort of outclass the spirit, and you need to commit better cards to the board more quickly. But I could very easily be wrong on that. It's a hard question.
Yeah, I
Anthony,
have
what do you
exactly the same question about this card. And I think that the answer has to be you activate it. Otherwise, what are you doing with this card? Like, it's basically saying you can either play this Elvish Visionary right now or lose it.
Yeah, that's how I'm thinking about it too. An Elvish Visionary with flying too. Like, basically you're getting the opportunity to spend 2 mana on a 1/1 flyer that does not cost you a card, which is kind of like drawing you a
It does
card.
not fly.
The spirits don't fly?
The spirits don't fly. It makes a warrior.
Oh, see, this is why we do
This card
set
this
review.
card would be ridiculous if it had flying.
Right, it's the spirit, and it makes a 1/1
Yeah.
token. I was gonna say that I do boast, and I'm still gonna boast, even though this token doesn't have flying, because getting to play an Elvish Visionary right now, I think, is good enough. That's at least gonna be my starting position in most scenarios. And maybe this turns out to be wrong, and I'm just supposed to play a 2-drop and keep the pressure on. I do think in certain matchups, you would rather commit things to the board and basically not lose any tempo and kind of ignore that value of that virtual card you would draw from activating the boast ability. But I think it's going to be underactivated by players of my own cube and other cubes, because people are going to think, well, I don't want a Nicky 1/1. This is cube. I have to play powerful cards. But actually, a 1/1 that draws a card is pretty good in an aggro deck. Like, I think we'd probably be playing something like an Elvish Visionary in white if we had access to it. I'm going to be activating it quite a bit, I think. We have one hot take about this card. One listener thinks that this is, in fact, the only card good enough in the entire set to be played in powered cubes. So, including Black Lotus and Moxen and stuff like that.
Skyrocket's hot take.
Hey, Andy and Anthony. My hot take for Kaldheim is that there are no good cards for powered cube environments except for Usher the Fallen. I think people are going to try really hard to make certain cards work or to test certain things, which is great, but I think a lot of people are reaching a little too far.
That take is hot, but they are not alone. There are a ton of people that were responding with exactly Usher of the Fallen was their entire survey submission.
That's true. I don't know how many of those were powered cubes, but we did have a fair number of survey responses where people were only testing Usher and nothing else, which actually makes me wonder if the increased responses to this survey was that we were reaching a bunch of people that don't test cards from most sets, but because of Usher of the Fallen, exactly, they actually are testing cards for the first time.
I could see
Yeah,
that.
I think it's possible. With respect to the point of it being the only card good enough for powered cube, I don't know. I think like some of the other white cards that we're going to talk about, like Doomscar, I think definitely have legs in powered cube. I guess if you're like the MTGO style of powered cube where wraths aren't that great and people are just sort of dirtling, and Usher of the Fallen, by virtue of being an extremely good aggro card, is just kind of insane. I could see it there, but
Perfect transition. Jett, why don't you explain Doomscar?
yeah, so Doomscar is the foretell wrath. It costs 5 mana and you can foretell. The foretell cost is 1 white, I believe. I don't know, I think this card is just really good. 94 people are testing it out of the unrestricted cubers, and it has a rating of 2.3, which I guess is kind of what I expected. I maybe expected it to be a little higher. I think a lot of people are comparing this to Shatter the Sky. I know Andy mentioned in our show notes here that about half of our respondents are testing this card compared to about 1/3 of the respondents testing Shatter the Sky from whatever set that card was from.
That was from Theros Beyond Death, was Shatter the Sky.
Right. I think it's probably better than Shatter. Just the ability. I know a lot of discussion online centered around, well, if you're playing this against an aggro deck, the foretell, in general, for a lot of cubes, the foretell mechanic doesn't really offer a lot of that hidden information that it might in traditional limited or constructed where you have lots of foretell cards. But I think a lot of the logic revolved around, well, an aggro deck can't really afford to not play into this, because how are you winning if you don't?
If you don't do your strategy, you got to attack.
Well, you just activate Usher of the Fallen instead of playing out your
True.
hand.
Exactly. So I wanted to compare this to Shatter the Sky because that was really the only other... I think that was the most comparable board wipe that we had survey results for. Yeah, as you said, Jett, we had like 1/3 of people that responded to the Theros Beyond Death survey testing Shatter the Sky, and about half testing Doomscars. People are a little higher on Doomscar overall, it seems like. I still think overall people are underrating this card. I think this has a decent argument for being straight up better than Wrath of God and Day of Judgment in a lot of contexts. It's a wrath you can cast if you don't draw your 4th mana. Like, that's a huge upside. It's also a true wrath you can cast on turn 3 if it's in your opening hand. No tricks, no weird stuff that has to go right. You just gotta foretell it, then cast it the next turn. I think those are really high upsides. And the downside is that, like, if you have the perfect curve where you want a wrath on exactly turn 4 and you had your 4th land and you didn't want to spend your early turns doing other stuff, you wanted to play, card draw spells and counter magic and stuff, then yes, you'd rather have the exactly 4-costed board wipe. But I honestly think that in a lot of cubes where there's a more range to what the decks can do than in constructed formats, I think Doomscar is going to be a super high-performing card and quite honestly maybe better than Wrath of God and Day of Judgment.
I think that is not such a hot take. I think on power level, I totally agree. The thing that I really don't like about Doomscar is in a cube with exactly this one foretell card, I'm really not excited to put this face down.
It does warp how that mechanic is meant to play because, the way the mechanic was designed was for limited and standard, where there will presumably be lots of playable foretell cards, and people won't necessarily know what card you have foretold, and there's part of that like fun mystery to it. But yeah, I think I'm gonna end up playing a couple of foretell cards in my cube, but not so many that people won't be able to figure it out, pretty much, based on what you foretold. And that's a downside to me, and I don't love that, but I gotta say, I've been really high on foretell just as a mechanic. Playing some Kaldheim Limited, it's played even better than I expected. I was excited about it because I like tempo-focused mechanics, but I'm even more excited about it having played it. I like the opportunity to spread the cost of a card out across multiple turns, and I think it gives you lots of options to guess at where you think the game is going, which is a fun and skill testing little game to play. Like, is it better for me to commit something to the board now, or to spend this mana to give myself opportunities on future turns to do powerful things?
Yeah. So foretell's really interesting, and I think, like I said when we initially saw the mechanic, I'm not really crazy about it because it doesn't really interact with other things. It doesn't do something exciting, but I did say I expect it to play really well. Like, when they're designing a set, they're going to really utilize that as much as possible, and they absolutely did. Like, this whole 2 spells a turn kind of mechanic that really lets you utilize foretell and set up these big turns works really well. And this other thing that it does is it lets them design, especially for limited, these very situational cards that often would be pretty low value, that because you can sort of bank the cost and not like take your whole turn off to keep up your what is it called, Iron Judgment, it makes those cards just a lot more flexible and powerful, which I think is a real success for the limited format.
Yeah.
I'm mostly excited for foretell because it brings Magic closer to a strictly better game, Yu-Gi-Oh.
I have no experience with Yu-Gi-Oh. Is that because they have trap cards, I guess is what people are comparing it to?
Yeah, I have never played Yu-Gi-Oh.
Great. So let's not talk about the card game none of us know anything about. I'm really high on Doomscar. I gave this a 3. I also gave Usher the Fallen a 3. Those are cards I don't expect to cut from my cube anytime in the near future. But I had to say, if you fast forwarded 3 or 4 years and asked which of these cards do I expect to still be running, I'm more expect to still be running Doomscar than Usher the Fallen. I could see them printing more 2/1s with upside that I prefer over Usher the Fallen, but Doomscar I think is the best Wrath we've gotten in, I don't know, a decade. Like, I think it's really kind of stands alone as a really powerful card.
Yeah, and so I guess foretell's a good segue into our next white card, which is Starnheim Unleashed. 2 white to create a 4/4. Do they have vigilance? I always forget whether or not all these angel cards give vigilance.
These ones do have vigilance.
They do have vigilance. And so then you can foretell, and then the casting cost after foretell is X white, and then you create X 4/4s with vigilance.
Yeah, so basically it's a 4 mana sorcery that makes a Sarah Angel, or if you foretell for 2 and then later on pay either 3 or 5 or 7, you get increasingly more Sarah Angels as a weird finisher for control decks or big ramping mid-range decks or something.
Yeah, I think this is a card that well, I guess first we should cover what the community thinks of this card. There are 79 testers testing this card and give it an average rating of 2.3, which is about the same as Doomscar. I think that's about what I gave it. I think this is definitely a card that will be foretold more than it will be hardcast. So for 5 mana, you get 2 4/4s, which is kind of a insane rate. The issue is that it doesn't commit super well to the board, at least initially. I still think it's great, and I'm excited to cube it.
I do want to note quickly that, we're talking about, these are the top 3 most tested cards. We're in just white now, but these are across the board, across the entire set, the top 3 most tested cards by our respondents. But already by the 3rd card, Starnheim Unleashed, we are at half the number of people testing it as Usher the Fallen. So a steep drop-off from Usher to the rest of the set a little bit. I'm really high on Starnheim Unleashed 2. I love scalable cards. I've written a whole article about it. I think they're great. And this one scales in kind of 2 dimensions, right? Like, it scales if you just dump more mana into it, but it also scales across turns. I think there will be not 0 number of times that you will foretell this and then cast it for just 1 angel on the next turn because you're stuck on mana, you got nothing else to do, and that's just better than doing nothing, which that could be a Sarah Angel on turn 3 if you got nothing else to do. Like, that's something. And I think people oftentimes, there's a common trait of people having best case scenario thinking about cards, and even I think when people give up the best case scenario thinking in card evaluation, they often try and think about most case scenario thinking. And I love thinking about just worst case scenario, like what happens if I'm mana screwed, or my hand goes totally off the rails and it's not what I want it to be, the arena auto shuffler screws me. And both Doomscar and Starnheim Unleashed, I think foretell is a really good mechanic for these fail cases because it lets you cast cards you otherwise shouldn't be allowed to cast because you don't have enough mana to do so.
Yeah, I think one important note with this card, though, is that it is not quite as good of a top deck as Doomscar because you'll only be able to just make a single 4/4 because you can't foretell and cast in the same turn.
Yeah, and people were comparing it to cards like Secure the Wastes and Finale of Glory and some of these other scalable white token-making sorceries. I guess, Secure the Wastes is an instant. And that's definitely true, but I have to say that I think in most situations where you're top-decking a card like this, basically it's rare that I feel like I'm top-decking a card like this, and if I don't do something right now, I'm dead next turn. And if I do, a 4-mana Sarah Angel is not a horrible sort of rate. I expect this to perform pretty well. I could see playing this as a, not the most desirable, but a totally serviceable 4-drop in aggro decks. I think flying is really important for aggro to get over some blockers and, get to pressure planeswalkers and stuff. And a 4-mana Sarah Angel, I think, is totally fine in aggro decks. And again, getting flooded in your aggro deck is your worst case scenario, but this gives you something to do in that situation, which I think is valuable.
Totally.
Anthony, do you have any thoughts on this card other than the extended art is very beautiful?
I have nothing to say about this card. It's just stupid. It's a scalable threat. There's no downside. It always works.
Anthony doesn't like talking about the pushed broken mythics, but it's got pretty art on that extended art one.
The extended art, I have one right here, and it is gorgeous. And that's the real saving grace. I will probably never put it in a cube, but it will sit here on my desk.
Well, I think the next one is a lowly uncommon. So why don't you walk us through the next card?
Clarion Spirit. So I actually like this card a good bit. It's a 2-mana 2/2. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 1/1 spirit token, and this one does have flying. I really like this card a good bit. I actually put it on my list as well for testing. I think it's just this really nice balance of build around where you play into it a little bit, but the fail case is pretty reasonable, and the upside is pretty good. So this card had 40 testers with a rating of 2.1, so people are pretty excited about it.
Yeah, it's also one of the most contentious cards in the set. And so one of the things that we look at is sort of what is the spread of ratings that are given a card. And so if a card has lots of high ratings and lots of low ratings, that's sort of a contentious card because people are disagreeing on its average rating. And this is, I think, the third most contentious card in the set or somewhere around there. And so, yeah, a lot of people are unsure about this. And I think that has to do with how you perceive it performing in your environment. I have to say, this is one card that I did get a little bit of testing results in with, and it impressed me more than I thought it would.
I had the same experience. I put this on my testing list, but had it rated pretty low. And that's mostly because what I'm usually looking for from a white 2-drop in my own environment is something that's disruptive. I want something that messes with my opponent in some way. Either it's really hard to remove, or it makes their spells cost more to cast, or it can make my stuff indestructible, like something that kind of just pokes away at their strategy and needles them, which I feel like is very valuable in the aggro decks. And this is really just beef. It's kind of vanilla creatures that you can just, make. But making flyers, I think, is a huge value. I mentioned with Starnheim Unleashed, I think flyers are really important for aggro decks in my own environment against mid-range and against control. Just being able to get over those blockers and pressure planeswalkers is huge. And the number of times you can double spell is environment dependent, depending on what your environment looks like. We have our own Land of Mordor has a hot take about these double spell cards and thinks both this and Bloodsky Berserker are the best uncommons in the set.
Land of Mordor's hot take.
Hello, Andy and not Andy. My hot take for Kaldheim is that Clarion Spirit and Bloodsky Berserker are the best 2 uncommons in the set. These are the spells that reward players for playing 2 spells in one turn, and I've learned that double spelling, even in cube, and especially in tempo forward cubes like my own, double spelling matters a lot and it plays much better than it reads. So I expect these cards to overperform because they reward players simply for playing good, clean, fair Magic, things that are already good, and these cards reward that.
I think I agree. I found that I didn't play this card in my deck. My opponents were playing it, though. And it felt bad. It felt like a problem I had to remove because even if I was playing a mid-range deck, and even if I had stabilized the board, well, then my aggro opponent just sat there and started spitting out flyers every turn. And it's like, well, I stabilized. I'm supposed to be winning now, and you're now making these flyers, and they're killing my planeswalkers because they're getting over my big 3/3s on the ground. And I think it's really strong. I probably will end up putting it in my cube and testing it for a while. It did perform better than I thought it was going to.
This is actually a card that I wanted to talk about because I find it very interesting. I guess this is Rydane, God of the Worthy, which is the 2 and a white for it's a modal double face card. 2 and a white for a flying 2/3. This card has a lot of text.
It's a flying 2/3 with vigilance.
Yeah.
And then it also has a bunch of other text on it. It says snow lands your opponent's control enter the battlefield tapped, and non-creature spells your opponent's cast with converted mana cost 4 or greater cost 2 more to cast. And the backside, I think, is a good bit worse, but we'll mention it. This is just an artifact that says if a source would deal damage to you from your opponent, it deals 1 less of that damage. And if their opponent tries to target something you control, they have to pay 1 more for each thing they're targeting with a spell. So it like taxes them and decreases damage a little bit, like a Pillow Forty card.
Yeah, I think most of the strength of this card is in its front half. And it's actually really interesting because I think this card is significantly more brutal if you are playing Snow Basics and you play it as worded. And so essentially this will cause all your opponent's basics to come into play tapped if you use sort of the strict interpretation of that. But actually something that was really interesting is 40 people are testing this card and it has an average rating of about 2.2. But about half of those testers are on Snow Basics and about half of them are not. But actually, interestingly, the rating doesn't differ between those two groups. And I think that might have to do with the fact that, this is not something that I've actually checked, but would not surprise me if it was the case, that a lot of the people on Snow Basics are sort of these power maxed, more optimized cubes. And in which case, the card is significantly less good than it might be in a lower powered cube, even if someone isn't on Snow Basics.
Interesting. I buy that. I think the Snow Basics thing, I'm not on Snow Basics in my own cube, and this card specifically is one of the first hate cards we've seen for Snow lands. And this brings up a weird question, which is, most people will say, oh, well, the basics in my cube are Snow, which is fine, makes sense. Does that mean that you're not allowed to have non-Snow basics? Because your opponent, after seeing this card in game 1, if they have none of the other Snow cards in the cube, could just say, well, I want non-Snow basics for my cube. And in every other Magic format in history, that's what you have access to, is you have non-Snow basics. And so that's a weird little detail. I think people playing Snow basics in their cube will have to clarify with their drafters before the draft, because that puts you in a weird spot of siding out your basics into different basics, which highlights more of why I don't like Snow. But I'm high on this card, absent any Snow abilities. I think a 2/3 Flying Vigilance is a totally fine body. Specifically, it's quite good, I think, against aggro, and again, mid-range for the reasons I think flying is valuable. But that ability of non-creature spells your opponent's cast with converted mana cost 4 or greater cost 2 more to cast, I think is going to be very backbreaking in a lot of matchups. It's going to shut off all board wipes. It's going to shut off, I say off, I mean, it's going to make them very, very hard to cast. So make board wipes really, really hard to cast. It's going to make most Planeswalkers very, very hard to cast. A lot of the things that control decks are looking to do, and even mid-range decks in my own cube are really leaning hard on Planeswalkers. It's going to make all those cards nigh uncastable against a white aggro deck playing Redain, however this is pronounced. So I like it a lot for that reason. This fits the disruptive things I like my aggro cards to do. Frankly, I really don't like that it has the Snow text on there because it's not relevant to me, and I actually don't even really like that it has a backside. I think the backside is a little bit of added distraction. I would play it happily without that artifact on the back, though one of my testers did play it for the back half in a game, and they did it because their opponent had a Bitter Blossom, which I think is a little bit suspect, because even though the ability sources your opponent's control, deal 1 less damage to you, is very good against Bitter Blossom. A 2/3 with Flying and Vigilance is also very good against Bitter Blossom. Yeah. So I think I probably would have still played the front half there, but it is giving my drafters more options, which I guess is good, but it's just not an option that I think is going to come up very often. And so it just feels like a lot of extra clunky text on this card that's irrelevant to my environment.
I actually did the same thing and sided this card in against an aggro deck, because we, again, like just said, all these cards are testing, you can put them in your deck, but also just throw them in your sideboard. And I played it specifically for the backside, and it really underperformed. It basically was a 4-mana gain 3 life that pretty much lost me the game.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Under the best case circumstances, it's going to be 4 mana, gain some amount of life, and that life needs to be a lot before I'm happy to pay 4 mana and a card for it.
But I think as the power level of the cube decreases, that effect gets more and more relevant. If you're in an environment where you're actually going to get into like slower, wider board states, that can really have a huge impact.
Yeah, I mean, it does affect not just you, but other permanents you control. So if you're having these big board kind of like combat-based games where there's lots of trades and stuff like that, it does really mess with that math. I mean, that's a lot on your permanents. I just don't think it's that much on you as a player, and so very narrow circumstances where I'd be happy to play that card, which is what's called Valmira Protector's Shield. Valkmira Protector's Shield.
But it's a modal spell, and that really makes it a lot more powerful.
It's true. I think you put Halvar on here, right, Jett?
Yeah, I did. Mostly because I want to talk about the modal double face cards relative to those from Zendikar Rising. So Halvar, God of Battle, is the white god modal double face card. I guess Raiden was also one, but I think this one is a little bit more interesting because it was the first one that we saw. And so 44 people are testing this card, and it has an average rating of about 1.9. And in general, people are a lot lower on these modal double face cards relative to the modal double face cards from Zendikar Rising. I mean, I think that's just because the fact that the ones from Zendikar Rising took up a land slot instead of a spell slot means that the equity on them is just significantly higher.
Yeah, I prefer the Zendikar Rising ones, both from a design perspective and its impact on games and drafts. I prefer having a land on the back, which has very minimal rules text, and you don't usually have to flip over to know what it does, as opposed to having a whole card on the back. A lot of these cards are whole cards that have tons of rules text on them, so I like it for that reason. I also think it's more powerful. Giving you a choice between two spells is good. A lot of these spells are similar mana costs, though, or they are, one side is very conditional and the other side is kind of a lackluster generic body or something. And those options are good, certainly. I will never undersell the value of modal cards, but especially valuable when it's a land, because so oftentimes what you're looking for is either to hit your land drop so you can cast your next spell, or to have something to do because you top decked a card late in the game. And those cards are just always good. There's plenty of situations where some of these modal cards aren't good despite their modes. And so, yeah, I'm lower on them too. Halvar is a card that it was the first modal double face card spoiled from this set, I believe. And it was spoiled well before the rest of the set. And for a while, I was like, yeah, I'm probably going to test that card. Like, it seems good. I think the equipment side, I think, is pretty serviceable on its own in a white deck. I think that's the side I'd be expecting to play as the primary side. And then I would kind of fall back on what is basically a vanilla 4/4. It's got other text that things are equipped or enchanted, but I would probably be playing it mostly for the equipment. But as more of a set came out, there's so many more white cards. Like, I love Usher of the Fallen, I love Doomscar, I love Starheim Leash, I love Clarion Spirit, I love Redain. All of these cards just kind of overwhelmed me, and I'm like, I can't test 8 white cards from this set, and this no longer made the cut, basically. Like, the rest of the white cards in the set pushed this one out of contention for me.
I'm sort of glad that they are not MDFC lands, because then Andy would never let us leave this podcast.
I do love the modal double face card lands. They're great. Anthony, did you put this next card here?
Oh, you bet I did.
This one has big Anthony vibes.
A quick shout out to Runeforge Champion. So Runeforge Champion is a 3-mana 2/3. When it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for a rune and put it into your hand, and you can pay 1 rather than pay the normal cost for runes. I don't think I'm going to put this in my cube. I don't think most people will, or maybe anybody. But I just wanted to point out that it's like a really nice, simple build-around that the other pieces to that build-around are kind of free to include. Like, the runes on their own are just reasonable cards in a lower power environment, and that, like, this kind of small experience of, well, I've drafted this and now I can take all these runes, I can take whatever color I want and end up like assembling this little package is a really kind of fun draft experience to me.
I really like the design of the runes. I like when they do anything to auras to make them more playable and less risky, and that's what the runes very much are. I also like cantrips. The runes are all cantrips. So I like that cycle a lot. If I was at a lower power level, I would certainly be playing them. I put some of them in my combat trick Power Matters cube, but not enough, I think, to justify Runeforge Champion myself. But yeah, I agree. I think the runes are really cool, and if you're running them, then Champion is kind of free because it's, got a fine floor, and if you could compare it with a couple of runes, it's quite good.
Yeah, I mean, the important things being that it is sort of an A-B mechanic, but the B is just kind of playable cards, which are fine, and also you don't have to draw them both, which really sort of bumps it up into this, like, a combo that just works.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some room here for some people to do the thing where you draft Runeforge Champion, then you just get some runes in your pool. I wonder if people will try that.
Yeah, those like draft packages people make sometimes where, if you draft 1 Squadron Hawk, you get 3 more or something like that. Yeah, I could see people doing that with this card. Finally, Iron Verdict, Anthony. You touched on this briefly, but did you want to sort of give your verdict on Iron Verdict?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I'm probably not going to end up cubing it because I don't think there are enough Foretell cards to sort of solve that issue with it. If I did play some Foretell cards, I might actually try and focus them in one color, and white would probably be it. But again, like, I really like this kind of effect, this kind of removal spell, but it is very hard to take your turn 3 off and just, if your opponent doesn't attack, you're kind of in a bad way. So this is where I think Foretell is really working, that it allows them to make this kind of effect much more efficient. Without just saying, well, it costs 1 mana and actually increasing the power level. And I think we'll see this come up in a couple other effects as well.
Yeah, it's a cool use of Foretell. To close out white, we do have a hot take from listener Alex.
Alex's hot take.
Hey, So I was going to make a voice memo talking about how excited I am for Divine Gambit, and I was going to do it by talking about Chaos Warp and how people think that card is so much fun, but how it could really be improved upon by having a more restrictive mana cost at sorcery speed and can't even target as much stuff. But in the process of preparing that voicemail, I came to the realization that Divine Gambit is a very bad card. Everyone on the internet is right. Don't know what Wizards was thinking with it, and I am still 100% running it in my cube because I love the flavor. I think it is idiotic, and I cannot wait to see it make me incredibly angry. Okay, bye.
If that's not the spirit of Cube, I don't know what is.
Totally.
On to Blue. Who wants to talk about Bind the Monster?
Bind the Monster is the blue Swords to Plowshares. Heard it been called in various circles.
Blue Vendetta.
Oh, well, I don't know fancy cards like you do. Swords to Plowshares. Yeah, so this is 1 mana for an enchant creature, and when it comes into play, it deals damage to you equal to the power of that creature, and then it taps the creature and it doesn't untap during its controller's untap step.
I think this is an amazingly pushed common. I was surprised a little bit on the limited resources set review when they said they were not really happy to play their second or third copies of this card because they thought the life loss could be really relevant in Kaldheim Limited. I would be playing as many of these as I can get my hands on, and maybe I'll prove to be wrong about that, but I think the card is really pushed. I didn't really consider this at all for my own cube, only because it feels like a color pie break, or at least a heavy bend to me. There's a couple of these in this set that I feel like are weird color pie things, and it's not what I want Blue to be able to do in my own cube, I think.
Yeah, I'm for sure in the same camp. This and another instant we'll probably talk about just feels so out of place. I have come around a little bit to... guess what? LSV is a better Magic player than me. It does feel more like an Ulcerate or a Shock than it does just a removal spell. Because there are plenty of games in Limited where you just can't cast it.
Maybe they're right. But I love using life
It's
as a resource.
possible.
I'll kill myself with Bind the Monsters and Ulcerates all day.
Relative to what the community thinks for this card, 50 people are testing it, which is honestly pretty high. I think a good portion of Pauper Cubers are really excited about this card, and it has an average rating of about 2.2.
Even amongst unrestricted cards in the cube, it's the highest common that people are testing, correct? Yeah. By a wide margin, it is the common people are testing the most, even at unrestricted power levels. So
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. It's a very unique effect. It's interesting that I'm saying that, this card is appealing because it's a very unique effect, and Usher is very appealing because it is a very known effect, but I think both of those are true. It's a unique effect, but it fills a very clear niche for a lot of people, I think.
All right, this next card is one that I have thoughts about. I gotta talk about this one.
Oh god, I hate this card.
This is Cosima, God of the Voyage. It's a 3-mana 2/4 that I'm gonna try and just say what it does because the text is long.
From memory, do it.
I'll do it from memory. So it's a 3-mana 2/4.
Everyone can go read it. Go do your homework.
You should go read it. But basically, on your upkeep, you may choose to exile Cosima, and if you do, she goes into exile. Great. If Cosima is in exile and a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may either put Cosima back into play or put a counter on Cosima, and then when Cosima comes into play later on, you will draw a card and give her a +1/+1 counter for each counter that she got on her while she was in exile. So, really funky, weird card. And then the backside is a vehicle. Let me get this one from memory. It's a 2-mana 3/3, and then when you attack, you get to take cards from your opponent. Let's see.
What's its crew off the top of your head? Go.
Crew 1. I know it's Crew 1. I just pulled it up. Yeah, so it says, whenever a vehicle you control deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles that many cards from the top of their library, and you can play lands from among them as though they were yours for as long as they remain exiled. So weird card. I did not know how to rate this. Here's what I think. I think the best play pattern for this card in many cubes is going to be to play it out early in a controlling deck as a blocker. A 3-mana 2/4. I mean, 2/4 is a pretty good body. It blocks a lot of stuff. We've learned from cards like Courser of Crufix. Really strong blocker. Then, on the turn where you're going to Wrath, you exile her on your upkeep, so she doesn't get Wrathed away. And then you basically have access to this resource later in the game. Hopefully you just kind of ignore it for a while, keep playing your game, keep doing stuff, and then later on when you run out of gas, you can bring her back, draw some cards, and make a sizable blocker. I think this is the strongest play pattern for a couple of reasons. One is that, again, the 2/4 blocker is pretty good at buying you time until you do need to board wipe, which is fine. And then having this resource in a non-interactive zone is, I think, quite valuable. There's no way your opponent can Thoughtseize or Mind Twist you and get rid of this resource. This card is in exile, and it's generating value for you as you're playing your lands. I think the other thing that people missed about this card, which I picked up from PVDDR's video on the top cards in Kaldheim for Standard, is that the threat of bringing this back with landfall, if you have a fetch land of any kind, is going to deter a lot of attacks. I mean, if you have a fetch land up and a Cosima in exile with a couple counters on it, there's a lot of attacks your opponent just can't make, even if they want to, because you could bring this thing back instant speed. And then you don't actually have to bring her back, right? You don't actually have to bring her back from exile because just that threat is going to keep your opponent at bay, and you can just keep getting more value as more counters get sort of dumped on her. So I think the card is probably very good, probably among one of the better, more powerful cards in the set. It's just not a card I'm interested in testing, partially because of that giant block of text, and also because it's not the slot. I'm not looking to fill a slot of like value generating 3-drops that are not necessarily good in any particular matchup or good against any particular kinds of cards. They just generate value. It's not a slot I'm looking to fill, I don't think.
Yeah, and so the community, about 40 people are testing this card in unrestricted cubes, and it has an average rating of about 2.0. So do you think the rating is low relative to its true strength?
Again, we don't know why people rated it low. Maybe people rated it low because they're like, am I ever going to learn what this card does and commit it to memory? We'll see. If it remains too complicated to figure out, then I will cut it. But yeah, I think for people that are looking to play very powerful cards, this is among Blue's very powerful cards. And if we were kind of comparing this to power ratings, I think it's better than a 2 on power level. But again, we don't know the reason why people aren't testing it. It's just, yeah, it's a weird, funky card. I think it's going to do stuff in Standard, and I think it will be quite good in cubes that play it. But it's just not for me.
Yeah, I just fell asleep reading it, and so I'm kind of off it.
I fell asleep trying to remember what it does and just relay it in a slightly more exciting way than just reading it. It's got a lot going on in that card. And,
I fell asleep hearing you read it.
Let's move on then and wake everybody
up.
We
often do that, don't we?
It's true. Let's wake everybody up then with a very exciting common, the next most popular common in the set, according to our respondents, which is Behold the Multiverse. This is a 4-mana instant for 3 and a blue that scries 2 and draws 2 cards, but it has Foretell for 1 and a blue. So you can basically break up that mana cost over 2 turns and foretell it, and then later on, scry 2, draw 2 cards at instant speed. I think this is a great 4-mana card draw spell, frankly.
Do you think it's better than like Hieroglyphic Illumination?
I do not think it's better than Hieroglyphic Illumination, but I think it competes with stuff like Fact or Fiction and makes Fact or Fiction look, a little bit sus, frankly, and other kind of big card draw that a lot of people run that I don't personally include. But I'm very high on Hieroglyphic Illumination because I think the cycling mode for 1 mana is great for finding lands when you need lands, or if you just top deck it and you just need to keep going and do something this turn. A top deck Behold the Multiverse, it's going to cost you 4 mana to get to your next card. You might not be able to afford to do whatever you're going to draw with it, even though it does dig you deeper. So, and you always have that mode, of course, with Hieroglyphic Illumination too. So it's not as good as Hieroglyphic for me. I don't think I'm going to end up testing it just because I don't think I have any more room for 4 mana card draw spells in my blue section. But I think it's really, really strong for a common, just in terms of power level.
Andy's going to get the Twitter mob coming after him for saying Fact or Fiction is bad.
Wow.
Fact or Fiction is not bad. It's just the fact that you can only cast it when you get to 4 means that it's not helping keep you alive against aggro, which is, for a lot of control decks, one of their tough matchups, and nor is it helping keep you alive against mid-range. It's really like you've already stabilized, now you need to draw some cards. I think it's kind of win more. Like, do you really need the best 2 or 3 cards off the top of your deck from Fact or Fiction? Couldn't you just have a card that draws you 1 or 2 and is better in situations where Fact or Fiction is bad, and not so much worse in situations where Fact or Fiction is good that it actually changes the outcome of the game? And I think Behold the Multiverse, for the same reasons I think Doomscar is competitive with Wrath of God, I think Behold the Multiverse is competitive with Fact or Fiction. There will be times where you're stuck on mana and you just can't cast Fact or Fiction, and you would much rather have Behold the Multiverse.
Yeah, I'll agree. And it's just a solid bread and butter card that pretty much any cube, regardless of power level, I don't think it's going to break anything. And if you're trying to get to that density of foretell cards that, some people might prefer, this is a good option to have.
Yeah, definitely. I think this plays really well with like Doomscar and the relative
for sure, yeah.
The other control related foretell cards.
Yeah, I put this kind of like on power level, I think this is in the sort of same ballpark as stuff like Scour All Possibilities, as stuff like Omen of the Sea. Think Twice is a little weaker, but similar in that it draws 2 cards. I think it's in kind of that power level of cards, and definitely worth considering. I think it will overperform people's expectations relative to what I'm seeing people talk about online and seeing the results of this survey. But onto a foretell card, which I don't think will overperform people's expectations. Saw It Coming is cancel with foretell, and then the foretell cost is 1 and a blue. So you end up paying 4 mana for it if you foretell it, but you get to counterspell for just 1 and a blue after you foretold it. This is a card I am not high on. Some cancel variants I like. I like Neutralize. I think the Surveil one, which I can't remember the name off the top of my head, is also pretty serviceable. I think Saw It Coming is significantly worse than those because costing more when you foretell it, I think is a big downside here. I'd much rather have a counterspell I can cast on turn 2 than be foretelling a counterspell I can cast later on turn 2. And I just don't think either mode is particularly appealing. Do you think I'm wrong on this one?
I don't think so. I think, mana efficiency matters for different classes of cards more than others, and I think mana efficiency for counterspells is at a premium. And so the fact that this doesn't offer you upside when you cast it on 3 relative to the Dissolve and Surveil variants, and then costs more and is less mana efficient when you have to foretell. Although you do get to spread it out over 2 turns. Yeah, I think it ends up being a good bit worse than those.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure why. I mean, we have a fair number of people testing this in unrestricted power levels, 34 out of 198, which obviously is not that many in terms of raw numbers, but it's in the top 15 or 20 cards people are testing from the entire set. And it's interesting that that's not reflected in Peasant and Pauper. There's not very many people, Peasant and Pauper, touching this card. And I think the Peasant and Pauper testers are right. And I'm not sure why people are interested in this card in unrestricted power level environments.
I think it's partially because people are interested in trying out Foretell. And Foretell is a little bit of an unknown quantity at this point in higher power level cubes. And so people are interested in seeing how it performs.
Yeah.
It has a rating of around 2, just for context.
Which is the same as Cosima, which I think the power level differential on these cards is huge. I think Cosima is way better than Saw It Coming. Again, we don't know why people are rating things at 2, but if it's at all related to power level, then I think people's evaluations are a little bit off there, because I don't think Saw It Coming is particularly good. I want to hear Anthony pop off on a classic rant, so take this next card, Anthony.
Give us the rant.
Why did they make this card?
Oh, boo, 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 boo.
So Raven Form is a 3-mana sorcery. Exile target artifact or creature. Its controller creates a 1/1 blue bird. It also has Foretell for blue. I mean, blue is the color of transformation. It's not totally outside of any reasonable thing. Yeah, it just is pretty efficient removal for blue. At the same time, I think it's actually worse than I initially thought it was, and don't end up playing it that much in limited, and definitely won't put it in my cube for all of these reasons.
Yeah, I also think this is overrated. I don't know why 28 people are looking to play this card. I mean, the one argument you can make for it in cube relative to regular limited is that if you're playing a cube that supports cheating decks and decks that can get these giant horrible permanents into play and play Eldrazi and stuff, on early turns of the game, then you might really value this hard removal, even if it's overcosted and even if it leaves a bird behind. I think for anybody that's playing a more fair environment where people are winning through creature combat and there's not huge cheating of mana costs, then I'm not happy to downgrade someone's threat to a 1/1 flyer for any amount of mana. I just don't think it's great. And this is a card that rated very low in the limited resources set review. They're like, we're not going to be playing this much in this limited environment. I agree with them. I'm a little surprised to see it again so relatively high with 28 testers at unrestricted power levels.
I mean, yeah, I pretty much agree with what you said. I used to cube Beast Within for a pretty long time, and that's in a color that significantly lacks more removal relative to blue, especially with the addition of counterspells. And so I think just the play pattern of this just ends up being worse than it reads.
It's not even great in a blue-white flyers deck. Like this idea of, well, I'm going to transform your blocker and, leave you behind with something is kind of a cool play pattern, but when you're just giving them another flying blocker, it doesn't even feel that effective.
I used to cube Beast Within too, and I cut it mostly for power level reasons, but also because my justification for running Beast Within was that it was removal in a pinch, because I'm not happy to give my opponent a 3/3, but it was mostly just, if you don't need your land, just destroy your land and give yourself a 3/3, which I thought was pretty okay, and that sort of modality is why I was excited about it. But my players never played it that way. I don't think I ever saw anybody other than me turning their own lands into 3/3s with Beast Within. It was always, turning my opponent's 5/5 into a 3/3, and this card's bad because it barely downgraded their threat, and it's like, well, okay, sure, I get it.
Yeah, I really do like that kind of modality, though. Like, I think the card that is along these lines that I like the most is actually Kenrith's Transformation. Because it cantrips, it, mitigates the fact that you're losing a card. It is definitely a bit of a bend for green, so I'm breaking my own rules here, but I do like that card if we're talking about these kinds of variants.
Your color pie hackles are up. You gotta be vigilant, ever vigilant.
The flavor can justify it, right?
Oh yeah, flavor justifies everything.
This is one you like, right, Anthony? Avalanche collar?
So Avalanche Color is very cool. It's one of the reasons that I think I would consider adding snow. I think, so if we want to go on the snow rant, I really don't like the idea of playing snow and just saying all your basics are snow. We've talked about some of the like weird logistical issues, but also it just means that all these cards that reference snow, they just have extra text. Like they should just say basic lands, and I don't like that weird thing that you have to explain. But Avalanche Color is one of those great build-arounds. I should find and read the card.
It's 1 and a blue for a 1/3, and then I believe you can pay 2 to turn a snowland into a 4/4 with haste.
And hexproof.
And hexproof. Hexproof being a very important part of this card.
Yeah. So this is, we talked about this a little bit on the tribal episode as well, how there's these two kinds of build-arounds for synergies, or two ways that they can work. There can be these things that really want you to go all in, you need as much as possible of a particular kind of card, or things that just need 1 or 2. And I really like the second category because it just allows you to not take up a ton of space with synergistic pieces. And Avalanche Color, you really only need 1 or 2 snow lands in play for this to be effective. So I think if you were in a cube where you actually said, well, let's make a small percentage of the cube snow basic lands, and add a couple snow payoffs, this is the kind of payoff that I would be excited to play.
Yeah, if I was playing snow basics, I would be slamming this card on power level. I think it's really strong if you have access to a lot of snow lands. It's actually pretty similar to Cosima in that it's a 2-mana 1/3 relative to Cosima's 3-mana 2/4, which is both reasonable bodies to block against aggro and buy you time. And then it's also this late game value engine that has threat of activation. There's going to be boards your opponent just can't afford to attack into because you've got this ability to make 2 4/4s at instant speed with hexproof, and you can activate this ability as many times as you want. It doesn't require tapping or anything. So yeah, I think it's really, really strong. I'm not into it because I'm not into snow, but the actual card I think is pretty pushed and could be very powerful in an environment where you're playing lots of snow basics. I mean, like you just make 12 power a turn and just bash your opponent's face in 2 turns after you've stabilized and remove all their threats.
Yeah, this is my pick for the most underrated card of the set for people that are cubing snow basics. So just for some context, there are only 10 people testing this card, and they give it an average rating of 2, and that's relative to about 50 people that are on snow basics. I think this card is just brutal. I think initially when I saw it, I kind of thought to myself, well, I'm not sure if my blue decks want to do this. It seems a little awkward for what blue is trying to do. And then I saw some limited games with it, and I realized, well, the point of Magic is to kill your opponent. However that happens is sort of beyond the point. And so if it happens with 3 4/4s, it doesn't really matter. And so I think this is actually a really brutal card that the community is underrating, assuming that these 10 testers are on snow basics, and the other people that are on snow basics aren't testing it.
Are you playing this in your own cube, Jett?
I am. Yeah.
It's
not a card I had initially, but
I'm both shocked by how many people are, playing their cube with snow basics, and I'm double shocked by the fact that not every single one of them is playing this card.
That is a little that to me does seem like the whole reason to play Snow Basics would be to play Avalanche Collar. So I'm a little spun by that too, but maybe they'll be turned on to it by this set review. I think Avalanche Collar is amazing if you're playing Snow Basics.
Yeah.
Really pushed.
It could be that this card is so powerful that it turns people off Snow Basics. Because I know a lot of people were upset that Rydane was making your basic lands come into play untapped if you're on Snow Basics, then it leads to really weird play patterns. I think this card, you're having a nice interactive game between 2 control decks, and then someone untaps and plays this, and then just 16s their opponent out of nowhere or whatever.
All right, whomst among you put Mystic Reflection on this show notes list? Who wants to talk about that?
I was thinking about it, but I did not do it.
Jett.
I did it because I think this card is pretty wild, and I think is probably my vote for the who knows how good this thing is from the set. I think there are a lot of different opinions in the cube community, specifically for the higher level powered cubes. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so this is 1 and a blue for an instant, and it says, choose target non-legendary creature. The next time 1 or more creatures or planeswalkers enter the battlefield this turn, they enter as copies of the chosen creature, and it has foretell for blue. So the way this plays out from what I've seen, and I've already seen some weird combo lists people have built in Modern around this card, but basically you are looking probably for some kind of token generator most of the time that, on ETB or on activation makes some number of tokens. And then in response to that ability going on the stack, you cast Mystic Reflection, choose a good creature, and now you get many good copies of that creature. which means that your token generator turned into a more powerful version of a token generator. There are also times where you could theoretically nerf a spell. Somebody casts a big creature and you use Mystic Reflection to say, well, when that creature enters the battlefield, let's have it enter the battlefield as this dinky creature that's on the board. That's also potentially a line. It's a very high ceiling card, which, people have done all kinds of weird combos with Master of Waves and that kind of thing. I saw a combo list that was playing Hunted Phantasm with Mystic Reflection and then their own copies of Impact Tremors. And basically, Hunted Phantasm puts a bunch of tokens into play under your opponent's control, and then you Mystic Reflection, so all of your opponent gets a bunch of Hunted Phantasms, which gives you a bunch of the tokens, and it exponentially goes up and gets pretty wild. But I don't see myself playing this in Cube just because it's got so narrow and weird applications. But I do think that as far as weird high ceiling build arounds go, the floor of just downgrade a creature if it's being played right now is not the worst floor.
Yeah, I think it also has a ton of story equity, which a lot of people value when they see Cube cards.
Yeah, I actually thought about this card a little bit for my own Cube, which is, much lower power, more synergistic cards, and it's similar to these cards like Kenra's Transformation, where it's it does just one thing, but that has a lot of modality to it because it interacts with things in such different ways. So the idea of saying, well, I'm going to play this with my Raise the Alarm and just make 2 pretty powerful tokens is very possible.
Yeah, I think the community in terms of its average play patterns is right on the money. 20 people are testing it with an average rating of about 2.
Yeah, the thing I'll say about this card, just to keep a little bit of perspective about it, is that, you gave the example of Raise the Alarm, Anthony, and that's certainly a reasonable, maybe mid-case example of this card. And you got to remember you're spending a card on it. So you spent your Raise the Alarm and you spent your Mystic Reflection. So 4 mana across 2 cards and you end up with, 2-3 drops or something. That could have been any other card, of course, you could have drawn. How much worse is it really if that card was just another Raise the Alarm or another card at, 2 or 3 mana that's playable in your own environment? And I think that the number of times Mystic Reflection will outperform any other card at a similar CMC is going to be not that many. But when it does happen, it's going to be cool and powerful.
And the fact that it is usually not a dead card. Most of the time you'll be able to do something with it.
You can do something
makes it work for me.
Andy, you're so floor focused. So boring.
I know. What can I say? I love floors, flooring, rugs, that kind of thing. I'm just a realist. All right, who put Allrund God of the Cosmos on here?
I put this here, and only for one reason, which is that I think this and the Red God, I don't think it's even worth reading them, but I do really enjoy the flavor of them. Alrund has his raven that goes out before him and seeks the way and then returns to him with information. It's a really nice top-down design. That being said, these cards are too complicated for me.
I really like the gods, the double-face cards, that the front and the back relate to each other. You can return this thing to your hand and then recast it as the other side or something. And this is one of the cleanest examples of that. So many of them just feel like I get that they're top down and they're rooted in Norse mythology, which is why they might not be resonant to me, who I don't know that much Norse mythology, but a lot of them just feel like 2 unrelated cards stapled together, and that doesn't make me excited to play them. Are we really going to talk about Ascendant Spirit? Is anyone interested in talking about this?
I want to talk about Ascendant Spirit for just one specific reason. So this is everyone's favorite brand new oh god, I've forgotten the name of this.
Figure of Destiny.
Warden of the First Tree is the card it is most similar to, actually, in the way that the abilities work. Figure of Destiny is also somewhat similar. It's an upgradable creature. This one is in blue, and it's a 1-drop, and you can upgrade it for snow mana all the way up to this big angel that draws cards whenever it deals damage to an opposing player. But it's just kind of scalable threat that you scale while it's in play.
So I actually threw this card in here because I wanted to pose a particular theory to you guys, which is that this set feels extremely, extremely play designed. What I mean by that is there are so many things that are weirdly asymmetrical or have these little unbalanced things. And I get the sense this card, the first effect it just changes. It's just a new thing. The second time it changes again, but it also gets a flying counter. So we're just changing types, but we're also doing flying with a counter. And then the third, it doesn't set the power and toughness, it puts counters on it. And this is so weirdly asymmetrical that the only explanation I can think of is they tested this card a lot and decided that all these weird things actually just played a little bit better by making these small adjustments.
Yeah. I think this is definitely a card that R&D was yelling at each other about for a good bit of time.
It's very weird and very clunky for all the reasons you mentioned, Anthony. And the fact that it jumps from a 1/1 to a 2/3 to a 4/4 is really odd and strange. It does feel like they were a 2/3 is what you need. It's not good enough if it's a 2/2, but it's too good if it's a 3/3. So it has to be a 2/3. And it's all right, well, Yeah, it's one of the most, and there's reasons, right? Like the last ability, putting +1/+1 counters on it, is relevant because you can just keep activating that ability and keep putting counters on it, where if its power and toughness just changed to a new value, you wouldn't be able to do that. But yeah, this card is very clunky to me. And it's also worth noting that I love these kinds of cards. I think Figure of Destiny is great. Warden of the First Year I'd be very excited about if it was actually hybrid instead of a gold card. But I'm not looking for this effect in blue. Blue is not the kind of proactive color in my cube, and I think this kind of effect really shines in proactive strategies.
Same.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we'll see this as well when we get to some of these uncommon lands where there's like a cycle, and I feel like if we'd seen this set a year or two ago, they would just say like, oh yeah, these all activate at sorcerer speed, like let's make it symmetrical so it's easy to think about. But it feels like in the same way there, they like tested it and made all these small adjustments to make each one play a little bit better in a vacuum. And I think that that's actually where, like, obviously the set is complicated because there's just so much text on these cards. But I also think that there's a ton of complexity in the set just because things are not as symmetrical as you would expect them to be. So you can't sort of like mentally shortcut these things.
Yeah, there's not a lot of shortcutting. I will say that for sure. That I feel the same way.
Yeah, I don't cube cards that compete design-wise with Hex Drinker, so.
Yeah, that's true. You have a very solid Hex Drinker first platform. Make Hex Drinker great again. Let's move on to black. I want to talk about this first card. This is among the top performing cards in the set. It's number 4 overall, and it is Valki, God of Lies, with 78 testers at unrestricted power levels and an average rating of 2.2. This is a 2-mana 2/1 that when it enters the battlefield, you can reveal your opponent's hand and exile a creature from it. And then at any time for X, where X is the CMC of an exiled creature, or creature exiled with this card, you can make Valki become a copy of that card permanently. Not to end of turn, just becomes a copy of it. I am very excited about this card because it plays in this great space. I really love hand disruption in black, especially aggressive black decks. We've gotten a lot of Mesmeric Fiend variants over time, but the Mes Fiend variants are a little narrow in the fact that they are not very good against mid-range decks, in my experience, because if you can't actually battle with a creature, the fact that it's a creature is just a bit of a liability, and it's also not always a very important thing to take from the mid-range deck, which has a lot of interchangeable cards. It's got a lot of mid-range beef. Taking any one card is not going to totally ruin their strategy. Whereas against control, taking their board wipe or taking their one value-generating planeswalker and leaving them with a handful of disruption can really put you ahead. And this card, I think, it helps play in that space where it's good in reverse matchups. Against a control deck, Valki is not as strong. If you reveal their hand and they don't have any creatures, it's kind of a little bit punishing. But against mid-range decks, you can not only take a creature, but then, again, threat of activation, threaten to make Valki a much bigger threat later in the game. I was saying on the Discord earlier this week that I would pretty happily test at least a black 2-mana 2/1 that had an activated ability for 3 or 4 mana to become a bigger, more powerful threat, which is what this will be in a lot of circumstances. And this has the upside of taking a card from your opponent's hand. Now, if you lose Valki, the card does go back to their hand, which is a relevant thing to keep in mind. It is like a Mesmeric Fiend. But I think just the front side of this card is very, very compelling and very powerful reason to put it in your cube. I was surprised to see that some other people in the community don't think it's worth it unless you can also cast the backside, which is a 7-mana red-black Tibalt Planeswalker, which is just a powerful Planeswalker. It's 7 mana. All you need to know is it's a powerful Planeswalker if you can cast it, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think in higher-powered environments, I think the backside is mostly flavor text, and the card has legs on the front side alone. I'm not personally testing it, mostly because I cube a custom card that is actually just Mesmeric Fiend, but 2/1. But I think if I wasn't on that, I would definitely be trying this out.
Do you think the Mesmeric Fiend 2/1 is better than Valki?
I do, yeah. The ability to hit non-creature spells against control decks is very important, I think.
I'm actually not convinced of that. I think Valki might be competitive with it, because I played against this card in our playtesting earlier this week, and just, again, that threat of activation. Like my opponent, I was playing mid-range, which is where this card specifically shines against, and they, exiled my Tireless Tracker on their turn 2 from my hand, so I couldn't have my nice curve anymore, and then also just kept attacking me with this 2/1 that they could threaten to turn into a 3/2, and I wanted my Tireless Tracker back, but I never had an opportunity where it was worth trading a card in play for it, because the cards in play were all I had at the time, and it was really, really kind of shut down my whole game plan in a very powerful way. And I think it's going to happen a non-zero amount of the time. You'll hit creatures on control decks sometimes. You'll get to take their Looter, their Jace Vryn's Prodigy or something like that, and kind of lock them out a little bit. I think just disrupting your opponent's curve and getting a threat that also scales up in the late game is a very potent combination. Anthony, do you care about Valky at all, or is it a too powerful, complicated rare?
No, I think it's pretty interesting. Like, it's a little bit less of a backbreaking hostage taker almost. It's definitely too powerful for my own cube, but I'm excited to try and draft in other contexts.
I'm excited to put the showcase frame in my cube. I think it looks sweet. Cool art, good showcase frame.
So you're going to add a Cascade package too?
I'm not going to add a Cascade package. That was actually... this gets into... We've talked about additive distraction on this show before. We talked about it on this episode before. We're talking about Redain with the snow land thing if you don't run snow basics, where that text is actually irrelevant. This brings up another situation where I think if this card was printed literally without a backside, some people would rate it higher than they rate it with the backside, because they see the backside and they're like, well, you play this card for the backside, obviously, because it's a big, powerful Planeswalker, but how good is the 7-mana Planeswalker? I don't think it's actually that good. And one of the first things that my playgroup asked when I revealed my testing list was like, oh, how many ways are there to cheat Tibalt to play? And I'm like, there are none. There are no ways to cheat Tibalt to play. There's no Cascade. There's none of that stuff. So don't worry about it. We're playing it for the front side. And I do think that's going to affect people's valuations of a lot of these cards.
The vanilla test has gotten so much more complicated.
This is a very complicated vanilla test. How good is this card if there's no Planeswalker on the back? All right, this brings us to Blood Sky Berserker, another card I'm excited about. This, to me, is it feels like a companion to Clarion Spirit in white. I'm not sure if it's meant to be a little mini cycle thing, but this is a 2-mana 1/1 in black that says whenever you cast your second spell each turn, it gets 2 +1/+1 counters and gains menace until end of turn. Jett, I know you said you were higher on Clarion Spirit because you think it overperformed. Do you think Blood Sky Berserker is good enough to play in your own cube?
Yeah, I'm significantly lower on Blood Sky Berserker, mostly because it doesn't give you additional value if it dies. And also the fact that it only gets menace, like the turn that you activate it, kind of turns me off of it a little bit. And I think relative to a lot of the other black 2-drops, I know you mentioned for white you like your 2-drops to be a little bit disruptive. I actually have the same sort of opinion of black aggro cards. I'm kind of more partial to the Mesmeric Fiend, Dark Confidant style of cards that either give you value or disrupt your opponent. And so I'm pretty low on this card. I'm actually not testing it, but I could definitely see it doing well. And if it does, I'll probably slot it in.
It's just a lot of fun to play with, though. Like, being rewarded for casting spells is kind of what I like about Magic.
I think this is actually, it feels to me almost exactly as good as Clarion Spirit. And
Really?
It does. And there is the point that it doesn't leave anything behind if it's removed, which is true. But I'm happy to have a 2-drop that eventually demands removal. Like, I think that's good enough. Generating value if it's removed is not super important to me at only 2 mana. And I think a very common play pattern with both this and Clarion Spirit will be on your turn 3, you play this and another spell. Like, you play your Blood Sky Berserker and you Fatal Push their threat or something, or disfigure something, and it gets the counters immediately. And yeah, the menace is only temporary, but I think it will perform the same role where if you are otherwise stabilized, but your opponent is left with a Blood Sky Berserker in play or a Clarion Spirit in play, they will eventually be able to sequence their turns such that it becomes a big threat and takes over the game, either because it makes them 3, spirits, or it becomes a 7/7 with menace, and you're like, well, crap, that's a 2-drop that now is just enormous. How am I going to sort of deal with this? I will say this about Blood Sky Berserker. The floor is much worse. Clarion Spirit as a 2-mana 2/2 is totally serviceable. You'll get into combat with that thing. You'll brawl. It's fine. If you top deck this and you have nothing left in hand in the late game, then this will be a bigger liability as a 2-mana 1/1. But I think in black, you have a lot more opportunities to kind of configure your turns to force double spelling than you do in white. I think in white, you're oftentimes just kind of casting your spells as they come off the top and you're hoping it works out. Black does have a lot of ways to get stuff back from the graveyard. It has ways to just even the self-recurring 1-drops, like Dread Wanderer's one specifically returns to hand and then you recast. Editor's note, pretend I just said Gutter Bones instead of Dread Wanderer. Gutter Bones. My current rating is I have both of these at like very strong contenders, and frankly, I'm more thirsty for good 2-drops in black than I am in white. So that's why I write them the same ways. Just the slot they're filling in my cube is there's more room in black for a maybe suspect 2-drop than there is in white.
Yeah, and I mean the community gives it about the same rating that they gave Clarion Spirit, although significantly fewer testers.
I think less people play aggressive black decks, which is totally understandable, but I have liked playing aggressive black in my own cube, so. We have a hot take about our next card, which is Egon, God of Death. This is a 3-mana 6/6, which is pretty good already. It's pretty good on the vanilla test there. And it has Death Touch and says at the beginning of your upkeep, you exile 2 cards from your graveyard, and if you can't, you have to sacrifice Egon and draw a card. And then the backside is an artifact that mills you on the beginning of your upkeep for a card, and then you can pay 3 to exile a creature card from your graveyard to draw a card, and that only costs 1 mana to play. So a very grindy card advantage engine on the back, and a very undercosted body on the front with the additional cost of exiling cards from your graveyard on your upkeep.
Feldmani's hot take.
My Kaldheim hot take is that Egon, God of Death, is going to be one of the surprise hits of the set. Obviously, cards play differently in different contexts, but I think that between fetches and cantrips and just cheap spells, Egon is going to be really easy to enable on turn 3, and even keep for a few turns. The real kicker is that even when you're eventually forced to sacrifice him, you still draw a card, so even the base rate is still a 1-for-1. On top of that, it also has the backside, which isn't quite as good, but is far from useless. While the strength of self-mill varies, a repeatable draw engine that fuels itself can be very powerful against a grindier deck. All in all, I think Egon's extremely high ceiling, combined with a very acceptable floor, will make it better than people think right now.
And the floor is basically a cantripping fog, so it's not that bad.
Hard to imagine your opponent attacking into you with your Egon in play. It is worth noting that Egon does not cantrip if your opponent removes it. So if you play it and it gets removed as opposed to actually dying on your upkeep to that trigger, then you don't get to draw the card. So it doesn't always cantrip.
3 mana target opponent discards a removal spell is also not that bad.
That, I think, is environment dependent.
For sure.
I mentioned earlier with Bloodsky Berserker that I'm happy to have my opponent have to spend a removal spell on my 2-drop because it's so threatening. 3 drops, I'm significantly less happy if it trades a removal spell because most of my removal is cheaper than 3 mana, so they're probably up on tempo. And yeah, I mean, 3 drops should be threatening enough to basically demand removal, I think, where I don't have that bar quite for 2 drops. So I don't like this card just because I think it's going to be kind of feast or famine. I'm not really happy to play a 3 mana card that either trades with a removal spell or cantrips. And the fact that this also has a complicated artifact on the back, which I don't think is particularly playable in my environment, it's kind of a non-starter for me.
How do you think this compares to Rotting Regisaur?
I gotta remind myself of Rotting Regisaur real quick, so let me look that
3
up.
3 mana, 7/6, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you discard a card.
I think it depends if you have a graveyard theme in your cube, because they feel similar in that they're overcosted and they care about sucking up resources to stay in play.
Overcosted?
But they're kind of opposites.
You're getting a little greedy.
Sorry, they are undercosted. They're undercosted, but they suck up other resources to stick around and play. They're kind of opposites in that if you're playing a graveyard strategy, Egon, in most cases, will kind of remove that value from your deck, right? You could say that you're playing a graveyard-focused theme. Part of the theme is putting cards in your graveyard, thus fueling Egon. But when I think of graveyard micro-archetypes, I'm thinking of a kind of very grindy deck that's reusing resources a bunch and kind of churning through its deck and constantly using its graveyard for other things. So you wouldn't want to be exiling it. And I think Rotting Regisaur really shines when you are using the discard to your benefit in some way. You're discarding a card for Reanimator and also putting a giant threat into play, or you're discarding a card with Madness or something, or a card that you just want in your graveyard for whatever reason. That's where I think Rotting Regisaur really shines. So I think the ceiling on Regisaur is probably higher because there's more situations where you can really abuse that discard and make it less of a downside. And Egon is probably a much more solid baseline, because the Rotting Regisaur, if you discard some cards and then it gets removed, then you're really just down a bunch of cards if you weren't getting benefit off of that. Egon, under most circumstances, trading with a removal spell or replacing itself is a much better floor, I think. I'm curious to know what both of you think of Dream Devourer. This is a funky one. This is 2 mana for an 0/3, 1 and a black for an 0/3, and it gives all of the cards in your hands, all your non-land cards in your hand, foretell, with its foretell cost equal to its mana cost -2. So it basically lets you foretell any card by dividing its mana cost across 2 turns. And then when you foretell a card, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So it becomes a 2/3 or, more if you foretell multiple cards. Only 18 people are testing this. I'm curious to know what you all think about this before I share my thoughts.
Yeah, I think I might have suffered from the so many cards, too much text, didn't fully process everything. I think this card is probably better than I initially thought. I'm not currently testing it, but I can definitely see it doing things.
What do you make of this card, Anthony?
I think it's very interesting. I'm definitely excited to play it in some, probably in your cube, definitely in the Turbo Cube. It's one of the...
It's a Turbo Cube slam dunk. I love it in the Turbo Cube.
I'm definitely going to have to play with it some more. Like, it's going to be context dependent how much that smoothing actually matters. I played it in kind of a controlling deck, in your cube, where I really tried to embrace and put a lot of these new testing cards in my deck, and it didn't really work there. I think in an aggressive deck where you're both able to, smooth out your turns, or maybe not aggressive, but a very proactive deck, where you can also get advantage of growing it to a pretty big threat, is going to be much more relevant.
It also, Anthony, lets you play Foretell the way you want to play Foretell in an environment where you don't have a bunch of Foretell cards. Because one of the complaints is that if you have just a couple Foretell cards, it's very easy to know what they are, which is a very reasonable complaint. Here, it just gives your entire hand Foretell, and now you have this ability on all your cards, and your opponent can't guess at all what you're doing.
And it's cool to just sort of have this like big change in the game. Like now that I've played this, the game is about the fact that I'm doing this separate resource management thing. But if you're a player that doesn't really enjoy that, you can not take this card.
Yeah, I think a lot of people embrace Cube for sort of showing the variety of different mechanics that exist in Magic. And I think this card is really cool in those environments because it just introduces this entire new mechanic and makes the game about it in this really interactive and fun way. It creates a lot of hidden information, I think has really good play patterns.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really cool card. One of the coolest ones in the set because it's also pretty easy to understand. Like it's kind of clean, and the fact that it does kind of unlock all this potential interactions with all these other cards in Magic's history is very, very cool. I think his card is better than people are giving it credit for, just on raw power level. Put aside the fact that it's cool and it does all this fun stuff. I think the ability of being able to essentially cast a card you should not be able to cast at this stage in the game because you've divided the mana across 2 turns in a lot of environments is very, very strong. I'm just imagining, you play this on turn 2, on turn 3, you foretell Grave Titan, and turn 4, you cast Grave Titan. That's a sequence that's unfair. You shouldn't be able to cast Grave Titan on turn 4, and you're paying for it, right? You're paying a card for it, you're paying tempo for it. You have to I think you actually want to be controlling the game a little more with this card because you need to have a little bit of time to get value off of it. But I don't know. I don't know where this thing has a home. Maybe it's like a green-black mid-range card that is another sort of ramp source, but you have so many other more reliable ways to kind of ramp that maybe it's not useful there. I'm not sure where this thing belongs, but that sequence is very strong, and I wonder if people are underrating it because they don't know how to account for the fact that Foretell divides the cost across 2 turns. I think dividing the cost is a huge upside on a lot of spells.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning, this is something that confused me initially with the card, is that if Dream Devourer gets removed, you can still cast the card and it still has that same Foretell cost reduced by 2.
Yeah, that is true. So it's not once you get it in play, you can get a little bit of value off of it, and it's not contingent on sticking that 0-3 around for it to still matter. So yeah, I don't know. I put this in my list of cards I would let people test in my cube if they wanted to, because I was curious to see if people would play it. I think you were the only one that played it, Anthony. I didn't hear anybody else tell any stories about it. And as you said, it didn't really fit in your deck. And again, I don't know where this fits, but it's a powerful ability, and it does kind of make me want to, brew some new cube where this kind of thing is especially abusable and powerful, because it's very cool that it gives you the direct control over the tempo of the game and the tempo of how your spells are played, which is oftentimes kind of occluded behind other decisions.
Cool card. You heard it here first.
I have a question for the next card.
Go.
What is a Dreadmarn?
Well, a Marn. This is a.
Oh yeah. Sorry. So it's a Marn, but it's Dread.
I know what a Dread is. So let's look up Marn definition. Nasal mutation of Barn.
Interesting. I feel like that's not
of Barn.
That is not what is intended for this card.
The top definition on Urban Dictionary is a misspelling and consequent nickname of Mark Brownstein, bassist of the Disco Biscuits.
Okay, well, it's good that we know that
Marn.
now.
Good stuff.
So yeah, that's what a Marn is, obviously. They went really deep on the flavor of this set, just looking into Disco Biscuits bassist nicknames. This is a card that I also somewhat suspiciously put on my list of cards I let people test from Kaldheim. I don't think this card is worth a slot in my own cube, but I think it's the kind of card that will situationally have a very profound impact on the game. This is a foretell card, again, that allows you to pay 2 to foretell it, and then for
black, just a single black mana.
Then for a single black mana, you can cast it later on in the game. And what it does is it gives you a 2/2 zombie token for each creature, non-token creature, that died this turn, which not just creatures you control, it's creatures your opponents control too. And so there's a lot of situations where you can imagine this card being quite powerful. And I watched people play this in my own cube and saw it do some work. I mean, in an aggro deck, it's kind of like Wrath Insurance. You can foretell it if you have time, which you don't really want to be doing in most aggressive decks or proactive decks, but if you do have the time to do it, you can foretell it. And then if your opponent wipes the board, boom, now you have a board full of zombies again, which is quite good. In a control deck, you can combine it with your own board wipe to basically turn your board wipe into also an army in a can, which is quite good. So I don't really know what to make of this card. I ultimately think that its floor is too low for me, I think, to be interested in playing it, and it also doesn't signal any particular usage very obviously. It's like it more cares about what your opponent is doing than what you're doing in most circumstances, I think.
Yeah, I was going to ask. We've seen a few of these black and sometimes green style of cards that, you know, have flash and give you value sort of post wrath. Is this the first one that has actually piqued your interest?
Yeah, I think this is a lot better than all the other variations of this kind of effect we've seen. Partially because of foretell, and also because giving you these zombies, I think, is one of the best payoffs for this kind of thing. There's a Caller of the Claw, which is a 3-mana 2/2 in green, which does the same thing, but just for creatures you control that died this turn. This is a lower floor because if creatures aren't dying, then it doesn't do anything. But also, what board state are you on where there's no creatures dying on either side of the battlefield? I don't know. This is actually the first one I think that has the biggest downside for the reason you talked about, Anthony, with the foretell cards, in that this is a card your opponents will actually be able to play around if they know you have it and you foretell it.
That's a really good point,
which is not really true of Doomscar for the reasons we talked about. Like, what are you going to do as the aggro deck if you suspect a Wrath is coming? Well, you're just going to keep playing threats and hopefully, you know, try and get them down low enough that you can put more threats on the board afterwards. But this one, I think maybe that'll be what keeps me from actually testing it properly in my cube, is that once your opponent knows you have it, like, it's pretty easy to play around it and prevent them from getting good value off of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, though, this is one of the real successes of foretell, where it actually just lets them design in different cards. So like we said, we've seen the very similar design in a couple different sets, and it often plays out really, really badly because you can't afford to just say, oh, well, you know, I'll hold up 3 mana, I'll basically do nothing for my turn, and hope that my opponent attacks in with a bunch of creatures so I can get value out of this card. But when you can spread that cost out and say, it's ultimately only going to cost me 1 black, and on the turns, you know, there's a couple turns where there might be a big combat coming up, you actually get to use it. So it does have that problem where it really needs a critical mass of foretell to be exciting to me, but I do think it's the most playable version of this kind of card.
I sort of view it in the similar vein as some of these other previous cards that give you value after a Wrath, in that the floor is just too low for my environment. So I'm kind of off it. And relative to what the community thinks, there are 12 people testing it with an average rating of about 2 in unrestricted cubes.
Yeah, not a lot of people overall testing it. I do want to give a shout out to Daniel, who listens to this show and has been a guest before on this show, we've talked about Daniel's approach to Magic and how much we love it and how he really thinks about the game in a different way. And this last playtesting session was a great example. Daniel built a really great deck that is not a deck I would ever have expected was possible. It was this weird black-white, primarily aggressive deck, but it had a couple of combos in it with Rise of the Dreadmarn and Doomscar. He was playing Doomscar in his aggressive deck, and the combos were that Rise of a Dreadmarn plus Doomscar very oftentimes would be basically a one-sided board wipe, because his threats were all small. It was aggressive, so he didn't mind swapping his threats for zombies and killing all of my stuff and getting more zombies for that stuff. So even though he was playing a proactive deck, he was still playing his board wipe because of Rise of a Dreadmarn. The other card that let him do this was I run Selfless Spirit in my cube, and he multiple times against me combined Selfless Spirit and Doomscar and just plague winded me, and I'm like, okay, I lose now. Like, you did it. I don't know. It's this funny thing where, like, I myself as a player, I'm very risk averse. I like to draft very reliable strategies, and I would not be looking to put Doomscar in my deck, my aggressive creature based deck, on the hopes that I get to combine it with either Rise of the Dreadmarn or Selfless Spirit. But, you know, he had like lots of card draw. He had Dark Confidant. Like, he generated a lot of value and made it happen in a lot of games. And it could be an entirely viable strategy as far as I can tell. And I love that about Cube. I love that he did that in my Cube, and it kind of drove sideways across all of the lines I had painted on the street. All right, these last 2 cards look like Anthony inclusions. I want to talk about the second one, though. So you want to talk about Way Down, Anthony?
Sure. So Way Down is cool to me. We have this sort of double spell theme that Foretell is really supporting. And I think that there's a couple cards. There's Way Down. There's also, I believe it's called Stalwart Valkyrie, this creature that you can pay just 2 and exile a creature from your graveyard and get a 3/2 flyer. And I think that's really cool because they've made these extremely efficient cards, which you need to support that kind of deck where you're trying to double spell. But by adding this extra cost, they're not just making these like extremely efficient cards that just take over the game, or you play out on turn 1. So I just thought that was a neat little design space.
Yeah, and in terms of neat design space, you also put Skull Raid on here, which is a card I love the design of. This is a 3 and a black for a sorcery that makes your opponent discard 2 cards. But if fewer than 2 cards were discarded this way, you draw cards equal to the difference, and it's got Foretell for 1 and a black. This is, as soon as I saw this, I was like, every single Mind Rot effect ever printed should have this text on it. It seems like such a clear, obvious upgrade where, Mind Rot is the 3 mana sorcery, target opponent discards 2 cards. We've gotten a lot of variations of that effect over the years. It's kind of a staple in black in a lot of sets. And it's usually playable in slower formats where your opponent's going to have cards in hand, and where it becomes a huge liability is like if they're hellbent, the card does literally nothing, and it feels awful.
Yeah, and especially because you often really want to wait till your opponent's down to exactly 2 cards, and then if they happen to double spell when you don't expect, then you're kind of in a bad spot.
Yeah, it gets value the fewer cards your opponent has in hand because they have fewer options of what to discard. And the fact that this has this kind of fail case of if they don't discard 2 cards, though, you get to draw cards equal to the difference. I don't think it's a huge power level boost on it. It's a little boost for sure and makes it a lot better, but I don't think it's better that I don't think it's so much better they couldn't print it at 3 mana anymore. I think this is 4 because of the Foretell mostly, not because of that line of text. And now I just want all Mind Rots to have that line of text on it. It's like when we got that green cantrip in Zendikar Rising that, said, look at the top cards of your library, choose a creature or land from among them and put it into your hand. If you don't, draw a card. That's perfect. That's what all those green cards that look at the top card of your library for a certain type of card should have done since the beginning of time. Always have some fail case where you can at least do something. And I don't know, I hope we see more of that on future Mind Rot effects.
Andy, king of the high floor.
I love a high floor. Tall man. We're on to red and green now. It may seem like we're going slow, but we have far fewer cards to talk about in red and green. In red specifically, we only have really 2 cards that we kind of highlighted. One is Dragonkin Berserker, which is the highest ranked red card in our survey, and this is a 2 mana 2/2 with First Strike. It's the first card with Boast we've talked about, though. It also has Boast and allows
Usher of the Fallen has Boast.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I forgot about our number 1 favorite card. Forgot
about only the most popular card in the entire set.
Aside from the most popular card by a huge margin, this is the second card we're talking about with Boast. And it has Boast 4 and a red, create a 5/5 red dragon creature token. And it also has this ability. It says Boast abilities you activate cost 1 less to activate for each dragon you control, which I don't think is going to come up a whole lot. So this is really a 2/2 with First Strike that late in the game you can get a dragon, or most likely cash this in for a dragon. Probably at the point of the game where you can attack with a 2/2 and have 5 mana up. You probably are throwing away that 2/2 in combat, but I'll be happy to do that to make a 5/5 flyer.
Yeah, I think this is sort of in the same realm as a lot of the common design space that we've seen for red 2-drops, which is that it has a fine floor and then it has some other upside that is relevant later in the game. I think relative to the existing cards, the thing that turns me off this card is that upside just happens far later in the game. So, like Heartfire Immolator, Goblin Crater Maker, and all of those things, their other situational upside is relevant earlier. And so that's not to say that this card is bad, but I don't really think that it competes with some of those more flexible options that are cheaper.
That's somewhat similar to something I heard the Solvay Singleton guys say on their review show, which is that they were like, oh, this is too bad on the floor compared to other 2-mana red cards we have. And if you don't get to make a dragon half the time, it's not worth it, which I don't agree with that at all. I think if you make a dragon 1 out of every 5 times, it's probably worth it. But it brings up a bigger point, which I want to make, which is that I think this comes back to, we did our level up episode last week, and one of my level ups was build a cube that can make good decks, don't just put good cards in your cube. And I think that evaluation of Dragonkin Berserker is like a good card evaluation of it. You're right. A 2/2 with First Strike is not as good as Carry Zev. It's not as good as Eidolon of the Great Revel. It's not as good as some of the other cards you mentioned. But an important point for me, and at least the way I think about my cube and have changed my approach to aggro, is that aggro doesn't really, in my opinion, care about card quality. It cares about having a 2-drop. And as long as that 2-drop is playable, there's actually not a huge difference between playing a Carry Zev on turn 2 versus playing this on turn 2. It's another body. It's going to attack. It's going to do the job. And so what I really like about this card is that it's a 2-drop that is not a dead draw late in the game, which is a really rare trait for an aggressive red 2-drop. Not that rare. I do think this is worse than, for example, Earthshaker Kenra. Earthshaker Kenra is another example of a card that has a 2-mana mode, and then if it's in your graveyard, it has Eternalize for 6 mana. I think that card is better than this card. But aside from that, there's really no other 2-drops that I'm really happy to top deck late in the game in my red aggro deck. And so I'm happy to swap a slightly worse baseline because it's still totally serviceable for that maybe rare circumstance where I get to win a game I would otherwise have lost because I drew my 2-drop after my opponent had already stabilized, but now I get to make a dragon. And I think that really highlights the, yes, the card 95% of the time you play it is going to be worse than a lot of other 2-drops you could run, but it's not going to be so much worse that it's going to cost you the game. And the other 5% of the time, it will win you the game you would have lost.
Yeah.
So do you think modality and scalable threats are good?
I think modality and scalable threats are good. What can I say? I'm a simple man. I see modal cards. I like them.
Yeah, I will say that I agree with basically everything you said. While I do think the card is worse than some of those other cards that have their additional effects relevant earlier, I do not think you need to make a dragon for this card to be good.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of go off on that point. I don't think that your aggro decks care about the individual card quality a whole lot. They care about executing their plan and having outs if their plan fails. And even though most of the time this will be one of your worst 2-drops for most of the game, it gives you an out when your plan fails, which I think is a huge boon to aggro decks that oftentimes lack that thing. Who wants to talk about the dragon?
Oh, man. So I would generally qualify myself as taking a power-optimized approach to cubes, but one thing that my playgroup has discovered is that if you want me to put a card in the cube, all you have to do is mention its really niche synergies with random other cards. And so I was not initially high on Goldspan Dragon, but then someone was like, oh, this is really good in this artifact deck you've been building with Tolarian Academy and
building
Urza.
that blue-red artifact deck.
Yeah, and so I was like, oh man, this card's an instant staple. Now, if I thought about it a little more, Tolarian Academy and Urza are really the ones supporting that archetype, but I don't think very hard when I am excited about new cards.
So wait, you're at 5 mana, you play this dragon, it makes you 1,000,000 mana, and then you make 1,000,000 more mana, and then what happens?
I mean, you can dump it into Urza activations.
Okay.
Yeah, profit.
Good point. Step 6, profit.
Memes aside, I think this card might not have legs in the very high power level cubes, but it does have... I just really like the card from a design perspective. I think the flavor is great. I think the ability to attack immediately and then hold up 2 mana for interaction is a pretty powerful play pattern. And I just really like the card.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just so many options for 4 to 6 cost dragons that if you like it, you can probably afford a couple of those in your cube, and it's going to perform similarly to a lot of others.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Anthony. I like that take on it. This is at 5 mana. We didn't actually say what the card does. This is a 5 mana dragon. It's 4/4 with flying and haste, and it makes a treasure token when it attacks or becomes the target of a spell, and it doubles the amount of mana your treasure tokens produce. So I think both your points are great, which is that, is this better than Glorybringer in most cubes? No. Most cubes are probably going to get more mileage out of a Glorybringer. Probably also Thundermaw Hellkite. But is it that much worse that you can't play this if you also want to play with the artifact synergies or the tempo ramifications of doubling treasure tokens? No. This will win 95% of the games that Glorybringer will also win. And so it's kind of a matter of your taste. And I think it's a great opportunity for designers to take advantage of those little synergies, because the baseline is so good that it's not really going to matter most of the time. So when it does matter, make it do something really cool that is actually synergistic with your cube and, inspires your drafters to do something unexpected, as opposed to just taking the card that has a higher floor for that last 10% of the time and doesn't have any cool interactions like Glorybringer.
And this is not the dragon for me.
Yeah, I'm still on Glorybringer personally. I like interaction, but I totally get why this card is exciting. This is just one of the cooler cards in the set, I think, and I think will lead to some very interesting brews in Standard where you can make other kinds of treasure tokens. And I mean, even just playing this, attacking with it, and then playing a 2-drop on your second main phase after you only had 5 mana is a very powerful line. So yeah, I think the card's very cool. I'm into it, and I think people should not hold themselves to the line of, this has to be the best 5 mana dragon for me to consider it. It's a 5 mana dragon. It kills people, and if you like what it does, then give it a try. That's it for red, except for a hot take from listener Matt.
Cryonicity's hot take.
Hey, my name is Matt. You might know me as Cryonicity around Discord or Twitter. My hot take today is going to be on the Giants coming from this new set here. specifically Quakebringer and Calamity Bearer. They're Giants Matters cards, and you may think you might not run a lot of Giants in your cube, but I'm sure we're going to get more over time, and I've really started adding more since Theros. I've got, or even Eldraine. We've got Rumcloak Giant, Thrix the Sudden Storm, Bonecrusher Giant, Shatterskull Charger, Tectonic Giant, Inferno Titan, Sun Titan, Kroxa, Titan of Death, Uro, Titan of Natures, Wrath, and Crystalline Giant. So I only expect us to be getting more Giants, and I feel like there's enough density with the 12 I've mentioned here that Quakebringer and Calamity Bearer do shine. I am running a 540 cube, and so there's definitely upside, and it's not all flavor text.
There's a lot of Giants Matter cards in the set. Specifically, the ones he was talking about mostly were Quakebringer and Calamity Bearer, which are both red cards. He was basically making the point that there's actually quite a few incidental Giants in a lot of people's power optimized-ish cubes. And so a lot of these Giant Matters cards, you might write off that Giant Matters line as flavor text, but is actually going to be relevant a fair bit of the time, which I think is true. Yeah,
the first time that my Cast Off, which is the other side of Rumcloak Giant, didn't kill my opponent's Inferno Titan, I died.
Yeah, and did you then immediately cut Rumcloak Giant?
Yes.
Yeah, it does matter. It does come up. I think that's a great point, and people should not just overlook tribal lines, because sometimes there are tribes that are popular enough that it's just good all the time, pretty much.
It does bother me that Grave Titan is a giant, not a zombie.
It's weird that it's not a giant zombie. Why can't it be both? I mean, isn't a giant a race and zombie a class?
I assume it's because the other ones are only giants, and like Inferno Titan is not really anything but a giant.
It could have been a giant elemental.
That's true.
A fire.
Could have been a giant.
It's both a giant by race and also just a really big giant. So
there are not a lot of red cards that really grabbed our attention, but that wasn't just us, right? If I'm looking through the list, it looks like the community is also testing a lot fewer red cards than other colors.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know why that is. I mean, coincidence, I guess. Maybe red's a little underpowered in the set at like the highest power levels, of course. It doesn't reflect at all on the limited environment or anything, but not as many exciting red cards here for me.
I want to actually start and transition into green with a question to Andy. Where do you get off?
Where do I get off not liking cats? Is that what you're going to ask?
Do you want to explain to me why you're not testing the objectively best card from this set and is what probably the best card ever printed in Magic the Gathering?
You're talking about Asika's Chariot, I assume, the cat-making vehicle?
Yes, of course.
So this is 3 and a green for a 4/4 vehicle that when it enters the battlefield, you make 2/2 green cat creature tokens, and whenever it attacks, you get to create a token that's a copy of target token you control, and it has crew 4. So this is a self-contained, like, very interesting take on a snowballing threat in that it makes you a vehicle and 2 2/2s. Those 2 2/2s can then crew the vehicle, and when the vehicle attacks, you can copy a token, which is one of those 2 2s, all as a baseline, and just get another cat every turn as you are attacking with a 4/4.
Now that we're thinking about it, it's almost literally Grave Titan, except instead of a giant spilling out zombies from his belly, it's a chariot spilling out cats.
It is indeed a strictly better Grave Titan.
That's the art I want. I want the promo art where the artist that drew Grave Titan draws a chariot that is spilling a bunch of zombie cats out of its chariot belly.
Secret lair, zombie cat belly.
It's not fun, and it's not going to play into your bit about me being a dog person and not a cat person, but the reason I'm not testing this card is because...
Play with us. Play in the space, Andy.
Here's the deal. I like snowballing threats. I like cards with a high floor. This is both, because the floor is you get 3 permanents that are all relevant, and so your opponent can't just undo the value of this card with a single removal spell, and the fact that it's a snowballing threat means that it offers value over the course of the game. I think it's probably totally fine on power level. I could absolutely play it, and it would perform in my environment and hang with my other 4-drops, and it would be great. What I don't like about it is I don't like that you have to attack with the vehicle to get the tokens, so it doesn't generate much value on the defense, which is against aggro decks, what my mid-range decks will be doing at 4 mana.
It's a 4/4 that could just block.
Look, I understand that it's a 4/4 that can block, but I'm not looking to play a vanilla 4/4 or a vanilla Call the Cavalry in my green decks against aggro. And then I said it can't be undone with a single removal spell, which is true, but it can be significantly weakened with even just a shock or a disfigure, because if this is your threat and you're leaning on it and someone kills a single cat token, Now you can't crew your chariot, you can't copy anything, and you're left with a 2/2 and a pretty bad vehicle. The chariot is
green.
bad.
You have
on
other
its own.
creatures.
But you need other
I'm giving my
tokens,
reason.
right?
I said I think it's there on power level. I think it would win games if I put it in my cube. But those are the reasons I don't love the play patterns associated with it. But I know this card is beloved by a lot of people because a lot of people love cats. It's got cute cats on the art, and I respect and validate all of their opinions.
Thank you.
I respect you and
I will say,
validate you.
Thank you. I will say, for someone obsessed with floors, the fact that you're not excited about this card is wild to me.
So actually having played it a little bit in limited, the floor is lower than I realized. The ceiling is incredibly high, and it usually just wins you the game. But if somebody kills your 2 cats, the 4/4 crew 4 vehicle actually doesn't do that much, and you don't have any more tokens to copy very often.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting the vehicle is awful on its own. Like, if this did not make 2/2 cats, this card would be wildly unplayable. It doesn't even upgrade your creature when you crew it, and it only copies a token if you have a token, which you might not always have. It's just not very good at all. So you're really relying on those cats being able to crew this vehicle and attack. So the floor is not awful because, again, it's hard to remove all the value of this card, but a lot of it can be undone with a very, very cheap removal spell just by getting rid of even a single cat. So I don't know. That's why I'm not super high on it.
So I'll take the devil's advocate position and defend this card. I think if your opponent removes one of the cats, that's like fine. Like, yes, relative to other 4-mana threats.
Oh, so now you're fine with cats dying? Interesting take.
Well, I'm fine with cats dying for the cause.
You're gonna get your ass canceled.
I think that green is also the color of like token planeswalkers. So in my cube, a lot of the planeswalkers make tokens, and I think it's not unreasonable, even if the cats die, for there to be another random token to copy. I agree if both of the cats die, then the card is significantly worse, but then your opponent spent some removal. You have this like random vehicle that you can sometimes crew to improve your attacks. I just think that even if your opponent interacts with it, the equity that you get from it is still pretty worth it.
I hear you, and there's definitely the line of like your opponent kills a cat, you play a Garruk, make a beast, the beast and the other remaining cat crew the vehicle, you make a second beast. Like, there's going to be some really powerful lines with it. I think what really does it for me is that it doesn't. I'm always thinking through this lens of what do these cards do against the prominent decks in my environment, and against aggro, it's not great because it only makes tokens when it attacks, and against control, if they board wipe, you didn't get anything out of your 4-mana really. The chances that you're going to be able to make use of that vehicle after a board wipe are really slim, I think. So it's, I think, really good in mid-range mirrors. I think it's really good in environments that don't have board wipes or don't have super fast aggro. And I think, again, it would be totally fine on power level in my environment, but it's just not, it doesn't fill a slot I'm looking to fill. I'm not looking to find more grindy mid-rangey cards that are good in mid-range mirrors.
So how do you really live the dream with this card? What's the best token you can copy?
Merit Lage. It's what's legendary. It doesn't
It's
really
legendary.
Work. Best token you can copy. There's the Gem Sire makes those 8/8 tokens with Vigilance and Haste, I think. That's a pretty good token.
I think the winner is actually going to be Jace Mirror Mage.
Oh, that's spicy.
Interesting. That's something.
Oh man, that's that kind of niche interaction that will make me cube both Essica's Chariot and Jace Mirror Mage.
Write us in. Send us a voice memo of what is the spiciest token to make with Essica's Chariot.
Should we talk about the new Carnage Tyrant?
Carnage Tyrant? You think it's that good?
I meant to say Colossal Dreadmaw. Damn it. I meant to meme. So Vorinclex, this is the new Phyrexian guy. He's a 6/6 with trample and haste and doubles counters on your things and halves counters on your opponent's things. Here's what I'll say about this card. Like 5-mana dragons in red, there are lots of 6-mana threats in green you can play that will sufficiently win the game if left unchecked. Most of them will, in fact. This definitely fits into that category. I'm not playing this because I actually don't have any green 6s in my cube right now, and I don't feel like I need any. But if I was, I'd be pretty high on this card because I like the way it interacts with planeswalkers, namely nerfing all of your opponent's planeswalkers and doubling all of yours, which, to be clear, if the 6/6 sticks around, is pure gravy, but it is just, at least it's disruptive if it's going to be a 6/6 giant body. And the fact that it has haste means you're almost always going to get to attack with it once. So I think this is a very serviceable 6-drop for ramp decks for people that like to play 6-drops in green.
So your opponent can still activate planeswalkers that are in play. They just won't put loyalty counters on them if it's +1, right?
They'll put half of the loyalty counters on them, and if they were to play a planeswalker, it will come into play with half of its loyalty, which I think oftentimes means they won't be able to play a planeswalker that would otherwise interact with Vorinclex because the combination of coming into play with half loyalty, meaning they can't downtick it now because it would they don't have enough counters left on to downtick it. I think it's going to be annoying against planeswalkers, more annoying than people think it's going to be.
And then you also have the Ugin equity, right?
You definitely have Ugin equity, yes. That's how you win games of Magic. Vorinclex plus Ugin.
The number of people testing this card is about 30, and they give it an average rating of about 2.1, which I guess is probably right around what I expected for a number of people playing it. It's just a card I think that at higher power levels isn't really resilient enough, but it does have haste, so the floor is there.
I would have expected a few more, given how many people are actively looking for green 6-drops, if conversations in Cube communities are to be believed. I think this is better than Primeval Titan. I think it's similar to Carnage Tyrant, probably a little worse, but Carnage Tyrant is very polarizing. If you like to play cards that your control deck can't counter, then Tyrant is what you want. But this, I think, it plays in a little more fair space in that you'll probably get to attack with it once if you sequence your spells correctly, but it's not completely insusceptible beyond that. But beyond that, it's hard for me I'm hard pressed to think of another 6-drop that I think is competitive with Vorinclex.
Yeah, I mean, I've liked, what's that 6-drop that's like the mini Crater Hoof? Gives your other creatures +3/+3. Pulling up my cube. It is called Earthshaker Giant.
Earthshaker Giant. Yeah, I think, actually, Kagla is probably in the same category as Vorinclex in terms of playable 6s. This is another slot where you have so many things at a similar power level that will all get the job done that you can really play whatever is to your taste. And Vorinclex is at least cool. We get a cool Phyrexian mana version of it, so if you really want to confuse your players, just put an unreadable version of the card in there.
So one other thing about this card is I want to make a correction/clarification from a previous episode where I said some of the templating actually seems a lot better in this set. Unfortunately, this card was actually leaked, and so we saw sort of a bad, photo of it. And I said, well, this card has got to be a fake because it's written like a human would write English, not like Magic is templated. It doesn't say whenever an effect or ability. It just says if you would put one or more counters on a permanent. It just reads a lot more cleanly, which I really like that about this card. But I will also correct that you are totally right. The complexity and the templating in this set is all over the place, and it's wild.
Thank you for validating my feelings about the complexity and the templating. I feel
you
very
are
seen.
heard.
All right, I want to talk about Masked Vandal really quickly. This is just the 2-mana Changeling 1/3 that when it comes into play, you can exile a creature from your graveyard to destroy an artifact or enchantment. I am not on this because I really don't want my removal to be situational. I want to be able to remove something if I want to remove it. So I still play Reclamation Sage, but I have been looking for a replacement for a long time because the body is very nearly irrelevant, but it is better, I think, in most circumstances than just playing a Disenchant variant because it does something against your aggro deck, for example, that has no artifacts or enchantments. It can still block and trade or something. And I think Masked Vandal is a very competitive card with it. Again, it's more of like a taste thing for me where I really don't want the 15% of the time where it just fails to work at all because nothing happens to have hit my graveyard yet is going to be really tilting to me.
You're saying you don't want it to have a low floor?
I don't want it to have a low floor, but I think on power level, across the board, if you were to average out how good this card is going to be, I think it's probably better than Reclamation Sage a lot of the time. It's just that I really want to avoid those fail cases in my own environment, which is my sort of reason for not playing it. But I think a lot of players don't share that subjective predilection of mine, and I think people would be maybe benefited by testing Masked Vandal over Reclamation Sage because 2 mana is a lot less than 3 mana. It means you're going to be able to double spell on turn 5 when you otherwise wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Way Down, I think that this is great that they're making this card more efficient, but still adding this extra cost that kind of balances it, especially probably for Eternal formats where you have a lot of cheap artifacts that are relevant.
Yeah, it's a cool space to play in. If they just printed a 2-mana 1/3 Reclamation Sage, then they'd be like, all right, bye-bye, Reclamation Sage, you're irrelevant now in all formats and all places ever. But they didn't do that, right? They printed a card that is better, but worse, and it has this cool play to it. So if you want to embrace a little more variance and a little more high ceiling stuff, then I think this is a very reasonable swap for Reclamation Sage, or run alongside if you want more of that effect.
Yeah, I just think you're completely wrong.
Wow.
What, you think it's bad?
No, I think Reclamation Sage is significantly better than this card. Which just feels weird because I'm arguing with you about the floor of this card, and that's supposed to be your jam.
Pop off, man. You're just saying you think there's a lot of times you can't exile a creature card from your graveyard.
Yeah, and I think specifically in environments where a lot of the artifacts that you need to hit happen early. So I think
I guess that is
in my
true.
own cube and in higher powered cubes, the fact that you can't hit your opponent's signet is just woof.
Yeah, I guess as you're saying that, I did realize that some of the times I feel best about Reclamation Sage are when I, turn 1 Mana Dork, turn 2, they played a Signet, I Reclamation Sage their Signet, and I feel very good. Because at that point, the 2-1 body is relevant. It's going to get in for 4 or 6 damage before it does anything, and also took my opponent off a land, basically. So yeah, maybe you're right, but I think people are still a little low on it. I think it still has some legs, possibly.
Yeah, it's interesting how much the power level scales differently. I think it's going to be quite strong in my own cube, where it's fairly creature focused. Creatures naturally end up in the graveyard, and a lot of the enchantments and artifacts you want to remove are, things like Oblivion Rings or Future Sights.
Listener Nate has a hot take about Blizzard Brawl. This is the snow prey upon. So it's 1 green mana for a snow sorcery that makes a creature you control fight a creature you don't control. But if you control 3 or more snow permanents, that creature gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible till end of turn before it fights.
Nate's hot take.
And I noticed Kaldheim offered a ton of super interesting cards and designs for Peasant. I'll be testing Usher of the Fallen, which I think will easily become the second best white 1-drop behind Mother of Runes. I'm also going to include Bind the Monster, which is incredibly pushed for a common. It's much stronger than Bubble Snare, which I've tried in the past. And the last card, which I'm very excited to try out, is Blizzard Brawl. This is a card that I haven't heard or seen any discussion about, which is really surprising to me, because I think it is a card that could easily slot into cubes, which include rares and mythics. Blizzard Brawl is a prey upon with additional text. First off, it's super sweet card name and sick art. For a single green mana, 2 creatures fight, but it also says, if you control 3 or more snow permanents, the creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible until end of turn. And this should be turned on by turn 3 by simply playing basic lands, and earlier if you could play something like an Icehide Golem. Giving indestructible means that your creature won't die in the fight, and if you only have a 1 power guy, you're able to destroy something with 2 toughness and so on, which means you're still able to use this spell if your creatures are slightly outclassed on the board. Having indestructible also means that you can still use your creature to attack in without worrying about the damage on it from the fight. With Prey Upon, often you get to remove an opponent's creature but get stopped from attacking in, even if they have just a single 1/1 in play. It's also nice that the floor of this card is just Prey Upon, which has been fondly called by some Swords to Prey shares. And Blizzard Brawl can still be cast effectively sometimes, even if you don't have 3 snow permanents to turn on the additional text. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this card, as well as other green creature removal.
I actually kind of like this card quite a bit, and I go back and forth on whether or not I want to test it. I've always really been interested in finding at least one card that is a good fight card in those kind of environments, because I feel like fight is a very green mechanic, and I'd like my cube to represent a couple different things. And I think if you're on snow basics, there's a good chance that you'll be able to just eat something. I think I worry that in a lot of environments, or in my own environment, you just might not have something big in play, and then just the inherent trap of fighting comes in where you just can't kill what your opponent has. And so I go back and forth on it.
I love fight spells from a design perspective because they give green a flavor and color pie appropriate kind of interaction. But from a purely spiky gameplay perspective, I don't want my removal to whiff when I don't have a creature. Or worst of all, I don't want to attempt to remove my opponent's threat and have them remove my threat in response, and I get brutally 2-for-1'd. That's the thing that really kind of kills me. So I think if you're playing Snow Permanents, this is a card that will definitely perform, because when it works, it's a 1 mana for removing a threat, making your thing indestructible, getting it for another power worth of damage that turn. It's going to be a big swing on the game. And just like any fight spell, when it fails, it's going to fail badly, and you're going to feel bad about it.
Yeah, I actually like the, what is the card from War of the Spark, I think, that lets you fight with 2 creatures?
Band Together.
So I actually like Band Together a good bit more than this. I totally agree. I enjoy the gameplay of fight spells. When I have them in my deck and I draw them, it usually leads to interesting turns. The problem is, because they have such a low floor, it's very hard to actually get me to want them to put them in my deck. So Band Together, even though it's more expensive, is still something that I think mitigates that floor a little bit better than Blizzard Brawl. So I think I like it better for that reason. Or, I'd love to see more fight spells that specifically are more powerful in that they mitigate that risk.
Yeah, we talked about Skull Raid making the floor on Mind Rot a little better, and that sort of green cantrip that draws a card if it fails to find. In a similar vein, I would love the way they make these fight spells work to change to basically be that you don't have to target your own creature. So you still need a creature in play, but as it resolves, you choose the creature to deal damage equal to your opponent's creature. So you still target your opponent's creature, but then basically, your opponent can't fizzle your removal spell with just one removal spell of their own unless you only have one creature in play. It would be a small upgrade, but enough that I think these cards would be a lot better on their floor. I think the reason they probably won't do that is just because of how complicated it is to basically have one target chosen before casting and one target chosen upon resolution. Not actual target.
I actually disagree with that. Like, I think the fact that you can get 2 for 1 with a fight spell is a net positive. Like, it feels bad if you're the person getting blown out, but it feels great when you're on the other side of that.
But you'll still have those moments where it feels great if your opponent only has one creature in play, or only one creature if they can actually kill the thing they're trying to fight. There's a couple fewer times where you get blown out by a...
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that reminds me of Affectionate Idrik, which was a creature that entered the battlefield, would fight something, but the way it was worded, if your opponent cast a pump spell or something that would make the fight bad for you, you could choose just to not fight. And that just sort of like felt really weird and not great, where you'd be like, well, I could cast this pump spell and it'll save my creature, but I don't actually get to eat the Idrik because they just choose not to fight. It just played out, I think, really sort of weirdly. So, like, I think that cleaner design of just... I think that the variance is important and is part of what's fun about Magic. I definitely agree that when I'm, playing and I'm trying to be a spike and put the best cards in my deck, I am looking for cards that have a high floor. But I don't think that just saying all cards should add a baseline, always kind of function, actually leads to better gameplay.
Andy just wants a well-polished, tiled floor.
I'm not advocating for it always functioning. I'm still saying you need a creature. You need multiple creatures if you want it to not be fizzled by a removal spell. I don't know. I think it's a small difference. I also I appreciate that variance is important in Magic. I just think that removal is one of the categories where I least want variance, because it's one of the ways I express my agency over the game, deciding what to remove, when to remove it, and having that be able to be fizzled is a lot worse than having variance in my threats or something. But I appreciate all approaches to the game. Who wants to talk about Realm Walker?
I think it's cool. It's every creature type.
Case closed.
Closed.
Every creature. I have a friend actually that is putting this in his build around cube, and it was fine.
I think playing cards off the top is fun. It's still one of my favorite things to do in Magic, so I appreciate any card listing play stuff off the top.
Yeah, I think that's really fun. The problem with playing stuff off the top in a lot of lower powered environments is it's extremely powerful, and you can generate a really back-breaking amount of card advantage. So in the context of little to no tribal theme, well, I think you need some, but of light tribal theme, making this something that is actually sort of dialed down in terms of power level and really makes you try and force building around it to a degree, can make this a really interesting card.
I will say I've played this in Limited, and I think it's got an annoying play pattern in that if you forget to look at your entire deck before you start playing, then you don't know what to name with it, and you get punished for not thinking ahead to be like, oh, I have to figure out which creature type to name with this card before I begin the game and before I even draw it, which, I don't know, that's not my favorite aspect of it. It also,
So you get punished for not playing the game correctly, is what you're saying?
No,
just memorize your deck.
Well, that's the thing. To play really optimally, you should just take note of all the creatures and all the creature types in your deck, and take note of which ones you've played and which ones are still in your deck, and, it's all information you should know. And in order to play it optimally, it should take a while to figure out, most times you play Realm Walker, what creature type to choose. I don't know. I don't like having these, optimal decisions that require a lot of thinking and public information or information you should know as a player. I think it's a little bit of a small... I like the card overall, but that's a small criticism.
I feel like I could say something really mean to you right now, but instead I'll just say it's a lot easier on Arena, where you can just click the button that tabulates it all for you.
Say the mean thing. I can cut it out if it's too mean.
Nah, I'm off it.
Damn. This is why our show's never going to be popular. You're never out there. You got to drag people. You got to
just
create
trying to
drama.
bring Anthony to the dark side.
You got to play your role of Dark LSV. That brings us to the end of all the colors. Let's talk about lands. Really, there's just a few things to talk about here. The pathways we saw in this set. Jett, what do you think about pathways? You ever talked about these lands before?
What do you mean? What do I think of them? In what context?
Cube. I don't know, maybe Cube or Magic.
Oh, okay, yeah, Cube.
You know
right.
The context we're talking about all these cards in?
Yeah. Well, I think I personally don't like them that much. I think one of the strengths of dual lands is the ability to splash, and these cards are not very good to help you splash. But I know a lot of the Cube community enjoys them quite a bit, especially for larger environments. And the Cube community, I think this time around, seems to think essentially the same thing. They score pretty highly at around 2.6, which is about the same as their counterparts did in Zendikar Rising.
I didn't look at these for my own cube because I break Singleton for lands, which means I'm almost never looking to add fixing lands to my cube because I just have fetches and shocks, and that's all I want, pretty much. But I do think this is an interesting space of adding fixing lands that specifically don't really work in 4 and 5 color decks. Like they punish greed, but still give you fixing, which I know is a sort of category that people are often looking for because they want to make their fixing better, but they don't want people to play 5 color decks. And I would argue that problem is better addressed by looking at your aggro sections and looking at your payoffs for being in 4 and 5 color decks. But if you really want to focus on the fixing aspect of it, I think Pathways give you a good option there. They also have the downside of being double-face cards, which this is one of the ones that frustrate me the most because which side is the front side is kind of arbitrary, and it's just weird that one side's the front and one side's the back. I don't like that aspect of it, but I think they maybe fill a nice, interesting slot that very few other dual lands actually fill, of being fixing without allowing you to easily splash or play 4 or 5 colors.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I actually like that aspect. I'm definitely not playing them for the double-face card issues, but that's a really, really good point.
If you have a Courser of Crewfix in play and a Pathway land on top, can you play either side, or are you forced to play the top side?
I believe you can play either side, but if you cast like a search your library for land and put it into play, you can only put the front side into play. Like any circumstance where you're playing it, you can play either side, but if you're searching your library and putting it into play, but not playing it, then you have to just do the front side. All things I don't want my drafters to have to think about at all, and why I don't like these lands. But I do like that they do encourage fixing without allowing you to very easily slide into greed, which I think is kind of nice.
Yeah, like untapped, pain-free mana fixing tends to just be good. I think a lot of the Cube community playing these cards for that.
Yeah, it's powerful for sure. And if I was not breaking Singleton, it would maybe be in consideration for me. Then we have this uncommon cycle of lands that all tap for 1 color of mana, come into play tapped, and have an activated ability that requires 2 pips of a second color of mana to then give you some, in some cases, very powerful effect. This is kind of similar to the Memorial cycle from Dominaria, except it's in 2 colors instead of monocolors. And I think these lands, for the most part, are very playable, and some of these effects are quite powerful effects to have attached to a land. The real cost of them is the fact that they come into play tapped, don't help you fix your mana, and can only really be played in gold decks that are playing both colors of mana in their activated abilities.
Yeah, I was going to say, Andy would probably give up his first form before he put a tap land in his deck.
I have gotten a little bit more forgiving on tap lands. I still avoid them at most costs, but I've come around to the idea that the first tap land in your deck is nowhere near as punishing as the second tap land in your deck, which is nowhere near as punishing as the third. Like with each additional tap land, they get progressively worse for you. And I'm now okay in non-aggro decks with 1 or maybe 2 tap lands per deck, which
you've really grown
a new line. Yeah. And so I like I especially like when they're fetchable, so I can go fetch them early, and that way I don't have to worry about drawing a tap land later. But yeah, I've come around a little bit on tap lands, just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, these cards in general, I think there's so much power in basically just having an extra card, even if it's a little bit overcosted, at the pretty low cost of playing a tap land. They definitely are gold cards, so for me personally, there's a lot of knocks on them. A lot of my fixing is already tapped, so it's really hard to support even more tapped utility lands in my cube. I have played some Memorials in the past, and it just ended up being really hard to fit them in when you also have a couple of tap lands in your deck most of the time. And I'm also, always fighting against my own inclination to put even more gold cards, so I think for those reasons, they're not going to make it for me. What I was actually looking at with these is, how splashable are they? So if I'm playing a red deck, can I play one of the ones that, is taps for white and then has a red ability, and basically say, well, if I'm playing red, splashing white, does this end up being a land that, pays for my second color, but then is going to be pretty easy to activate once I draw my second planes? I don't think any of them quite get there for me, but that's kind of where the most interest was.
I think it's a good point. Their activated abilities are all pretty expensive because they are stapled to a land, which is the cost you pay for having a spell attached to a land. So I don't know. I could see that being the way they would mostly be played, and I could see people overlooking that because in their head they're shortcutting it to it's a white land, when in actuality, even though it taps for white, it maybe is more of a red land because the red is the expensive part of the activation you're looking to play. I think overall, at lower power levels, for all that I hate tapped lands, I think players undervalue tapped lands with late game relevance, like the Memorials, like the Castles, like these lands, because man lands get rated very highly, right? Like, people play the man lands in power unrestricted cubes very happily, and the upside on those is that you can temporarily make them a creature, which, frankly, I don't think is as good as the upside on a lot of these lands we're seeing here. Like, if these tap for 2 colors, I think a lot of them will be a lot better than the respective creature lands in their color pair. And I just think that these are probably among some of the better things you can do at lower power levels, certainly at, like, Peasant, for example, with tap lands. And I think people tend to just think that those abilities should be better when they're stapled to a land, but it's just huge value to have an ability like that attached to a land.
I wonder if these maybe even started out as rare fixing lands as well, and then got bumped down because I was just too overpowered.
I could see that. I wouldn't be surprised to hear on a future Drive to Work that these were initially a little better and at a higher rarity, and they just got juggled around because of the balancing of the set. That would not shock me.
The fact that we have, an off-color activation on a land that taps for color, that's something that we've never seen before, and was surprising to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the space. I think it's cool.
I think for these lands, I think it's worth mentioning for the actual survey, actually only 2 of the lands show up for Peasant Cubers, and it's the blue-green land that makes a copy of a creature token you have, or a creature you have in play, and then the blue-black land, which reanimates something, which I think are probably the most powerful effect.
I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but I remember the reanimation one looking very strong to me. Because that's exactly the thing you want to do super late in the game anyway, and I believe it's on the blue land, the land that taps for blue, which is a color that in most cubes is going to be going to the late game anyway. So.
Right.
All right, last land is Shimmerdrift Vale. I see here in the notes that somebody had this card ruin Thriving Lands for them.
So this card is, it's a snow land, it enters the battlefield, you choose a color, and it taps for that color. So it's basically, as far as the play pattern, exactly Evolving Wilds, minus interactions with other cards. The problem I have with it is as soon as I read and parsed this card, I was then like, oh wait, this is just also the Thriving Lands, but without the tap for an extra color. And then I realized, well, okay, if I'm in an environment where I would rate Evolving Wilds pretty highly, which a lot of lower powered cubes are, that also means I shouldn't be thinking of, Thriving Heath as a white X land. It's just any color. It's just an Evolving Wilds that has even a little bit of gravy if I happen to be playing white. So that was a weird mental shift for me, and the Thriving Lands are not something I'd actually put into any cubes, but were, something that I was considering in some contexts, and I think because they're just actually these 5-color lands, I'm just not that interested in them.
I had never made that connection either, but you're basically, what you're saying, to repeat it, is that, you might think of Thriving Heath as a land you can only play if you're playing white and some other color, and then it becomes a duel in that color pair. But you're saying, like, nah, forget that. If I'm playing red-black, I play Thriving Heath, and then if I need red, I name red. If I need black, I name black, and I ignore that it produces white, because who cares?
Exactly, yeah.
I had never thought of it that way either, but I think you are totally right. I don't know if it ruins Thriving Lands for me, but it does make me look at them through a different lens.
It just means that, as a player, that feels like a level up that I can now just have access to more fixing I didn't think to. But as a designer, it feels like you're just putting in cards that don't really do what they say.
You've said that before in the show, that like you don't like when cards don't do what they say. It's a criticism you've made of the Degenerate Microcube many times, that you think the cards don't do what they say on them. And I don't know. I feel like to some degree, that's just like, that's playing Magic. Like, some players see the game, that's what being a good player is seeing cards that can be used in ways that other players can't see. And it's whether it comes down to like knowing you can bluff an attack here, or knowing that you can cast this spell second main phase, and that will cause your opponent to make a decision differently. Like, I think that's just Magic.
You're not wrong, but I'll think about this more. But it definitely, in some contexts, it feels more like obfuscation than an opportunity to learn and explore.
Because it's so hard to discover, basically. Like, it's
hard to discover, and once you know it, it's so simple.
Sure. Well, that's a good level up on Thriving Lands. None of us flagged any colorless cards to talk about.
I actually would throw in Bloodline Pretender, the reverse Metallic Mimic. So it's 3 mana for a 2/2, and whenever a creature, you choose a creature type, and whenever you get a creature of that type, you put a counter on it. I think this card is going to perform really well. I'm always looking for more shapeshifters to support a little bit of edge case tribal interactions. And I think it's just going to be a good beater in a lower power level cube, where you play this and then play a Raise the Alarm and end up with a 4/4 attacking on turn 4 is going to be a pretty good card.
Yeah, I'd rather have Metallic Mimic, but I see what you're saying.
I'd rather
for sure, yeah. It's definitely the worst option.
In terms of the survey, the highest rated colorless card, I believe, is Goldvein Pick, which only 7 people are playing.
Not a lot of colorless cards, I guess, in this set at the highest power levels or at the weird design space. All right, on to gold. We only have 2 cards here, but both are cards I'm excited to talk about. So The first one is Showdown of the Scalds. This is the 4-mana Boros saga, and the first chapter is that you exile the top 4 cards of your library, and you can play those cards until the end of your next turn. So it's similar to Light Up the Stage, which is, I don't know, that is kind of a weird, frustrating twist on the impulsive draw. I mean, it's not frustrating because it makes it much better, but I think it's hard to remember sometimes which card is which. Like, your Abbot of Carolkeep, you have to play it exactly this turn, but your Showdown of the Scalds and your Light Up the Stage, you have till next turn. Either way, the second 2 chapters are whenever you cast a spell this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So kind of draw 4 cards, and then over the next 2 turns, get rewarded for casting spells by making all your creatures bigger. I highlighted this because Cube designers at the highest power levels are always talking about how they want a good Boros card for aggro decks. And yet, I have not seen almost anybody talking about this card, even though I think it is probably the best Boros aggro card we've ever seen printed. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, it is 4 mana, so being 2 red-white, it is much, much, much easier to splash in a mostly mono red deck or a mostly mono white deck with a few sources of the other color, which I think is what a lot of Boros aggro decks end up being, or at least enough of them that you have to evaluate the overall power level of a Boros aggro card with that use case in mind. Now, is Tajik Legion's Edge or Sky Knight Vanguard better in a pure Boros deck with lots of fixing? Probably, but a lot of times those decks don't come together and those cards are much less splashable. The other thing I'll say about it is that I think people look at this card and they say, well, this isn't an aggro card because I want to be pressuring my opponent. I want to be beating down. I don't want to be generating card advantage. And I think that is a narrow view on what aggro is. And what you oftentimes want from your high-end spells, especially in an aggro deck, is something that does compete on a different axis. Like, people are happy to put a Planeswalker in their aggro decks, and Planeswalkers are not anywhere near the same board presence for mana cost as an equivalently costed creature at the same power level, right? Playing a Gideon Ally of Zendikar makes a 2/2, as opposed to making a 3/4 flyer or a Hell Rider or something. It is nowhere near the immediate board presence, but the reason it's still good is it gives you another axis on which to compete. And oftentimes, by the time you get to 4 mana spells, you want to compete on another axis because the game is otherwise stalled out or you've gotten sort of stuffed out by your opponent. This is a nightmare for control decks. You draw 4 cards and then get a bunch of benefits from casting spells is a huge deal. It's also a nightmare in a board stall. If you're in an aggro mirror, if you're up against a mid-range deck that is stabilized against you with a few bigger blockers that you can't get through, being able to start dumping counters on your creatures in the next 2 turns is a huge value. I think this card is very strong if you want Boros aggro to be a thing in your cube. Now, all that said, I put this in my list of cards I would let people test from my testing list from our latest draft. And a couple of people even said, like, I'm going to force Boros aggro. I get all these good white aggro cards at Showdown of the Scalds. And yet, nobody played Boros aggro and no one played Showdown of the Scalds. So,
well, everyone knew everyone was going to force it, and so we all scared each other off.
I'm not on this card because I don't think it's necessary, and I actually don't really want to push 2-color aggro decks in my own cube. But I think if you do, I think this is the best reason I've seen for it printed in Boros since the beginning of Magic history. I think this card's very powerful and it has a lot of potential.
I'm curious, Andy, do you think this card is better than a Johnny Vengeance?
I do think it's better than a Johnny Vengeance in most aggro strategies. And I'll say that my current, before printing of Showdown of the Scalds, I think the best aggro for was Heroic Reinforcements, which is the 4-mana sorcery that makes 2 1/1s and gives all creatures haste and +1/+0 until end of turn, which I think was another way, like, if you're in a board stall, you just get to do this and all of a sudden break through that board stall because all of your attackers are way bigger and you get 2 more bodies on the board immediately. I think this is better than that too. Yeah, I think it's better than a Johnny Vengeance. It's probably not better. It's not better than a Johnny Vengeance if you are talking about like if you play like big Boros, if you have like a control deck that's playing red-white, I don't think it's better. It's probably similar but not as good if you're like splashing one of these in a green-red or green-white deck. But in aggro, I think it's better, yeah.
I actually think it's substantially better than both those cards in even all of those contexts. I think the better way that you could frame this card is it's just Experimental Frenzy that also punches your opponent very hard.
Yeah, I mean, 4 cards is a lot of cards. And I think you really want to be in a deck that is going to get the full value off of that, which means having those cards.
And you get counters for the next 2 turns, right?
Yeah, the next 2 turns. That's another thing that's weird about the design. You get counters for the next 2 turns, but you can only cast those cards on your next turn, which is a little weird.
Yeah, I'm curious exactly how many spells you would often cast off of this card. It's surely not all 4.
Well, you can also play lands, so I'm expecting that a lot of times you do get to play all 4 cards, I'm guessing.
Really? You think you flip 1 land and then 3 non-lands?
Well, if you play this on turn 5, you get to play 2 lands from it.
Sure. I guess I was thinking
I think you will more
flip.
often whiff on the lands than you will actually whiff on the spells. So, like, I think you will get to play all of the spells off this in an aggro deck every time, and you might whiff on a land or 2. But in that case, like, it also got you through the top of your deck, which was going to be bad draws anyway, which it's something. It's not nothing. Drawing cards is always good, even when you sometimes draw a land and you don't want to draw a land.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think this card, I was surprised that more people weren't like, hooray, we finally got our Boros aggro card, because this to me seems like what everyone has been wanting, and yet they still don't want it, which just proves I don't understand people.
Only 16 people are on it in this survey.
Yeah, and the people that are on it don't seem particularly enthusiastic about it from conversation I've seen online. So I don't know, I think the card's good. I think if you want Boros aggro, you should try it. That brings us to our last card, which I'm going to throw to Anthony for.
So I really like Maja.
I like your Maja too.
Brett Guard Protector.
She's a nice lady.
So I have a little bit of a landfall theme in my own cube. I have had in the past Rampaging Baloths, which was, one of the actual core cards that I really wanted to play, and I built my cube around. It turned out in that specific context, it was way overpowered. On the other hand, Spore Mound is way underpowered. So at first I saw this and was just like, well, it's another Spore Mound, but it's in 2 colors, so it's potentially even worse. But I think the Anthem effect is actually...
Anthony, tell him what the card does.
Great point. Well, it's sort of like if a Spore Mound and Rampaging Baloths got together.
Everyone knows what a Spore Mound and a Rampaging Baloths does.
So the card is 5 mana, 2 green, white for a 2/3. Other creatures you control get +1/+1, and whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 white human warrior creature token. So it really plays into that landfall theme. It is pretty pricey at 5 mana, and it is gold, but I think the Anthem effect is actually much more relevant than I initially thought, and will let you force through an attack on the turn you play it, so even if it gets removed right away, I think it can still have an impact. I think it's going to perform really well in a lower powered environment.
I love this card for your cube. I think the design is great. I think it's really elegant. Like you said, it has immediate impact in the Anthem, and it has long-term value in playing lands. It's another reason for you to hold back your Prismatic Vistas in your cube. Yeah, this, I think it's like, it reminded me a little bit of Tristani Discordant, but Tristani Discordant is obviously much more powerful at Mythic and coming with an army kind of already, but that would be broken in your cube, and I think this is actually this card is perfect for your cube. I got excited for your cube when I saw this card.
Oh, my cube says thanks. I am going to force myself to cut another Selesnya card, and that's going to be a challenge.
Oh, that's going to be very hard for you. You love those
hard
cards.
Cuts.
Anthony, why don't you just put more cards in your cube? Never cut a card you like. You keep getting bigger.
You got me.
All right, we've been recording forever, but that's our last card. Jett? You're the creator of the Prospective series. Our article is live as this podcast is going up. People should go there and check out the entirety of the community responses to all the cards. To take us on home, close this episode out. How do you want to close it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we added for this survey that was pretty cool is the additional comments. And I think it might be worth to sort of summarize some feelings towards this set that we've read. I think there was, for me, a lot of people lamenting the complexity of the cards. I think a lot of people complained about snow, the fact that a lot of these cards sort of had additive distraction with respect to snow.
I feel like the complexity is the byproduct of a top-down set. It's very hard, I think, to tell these stories with very, very simple cards, and so we end up with all these things like the, Cosima and all these other complicated cards because they're telling the story of a sort of particular history, which I think is cool. I don't mind that occasionally sets will be complicated. I'm a very enfranchised player. I don't mind complicated cards. The snow thing I think is kind of unique to us as cube designers in that it does present this weird catch-22 of like, all right, well, are all your basics snow now or not? And if they're not, how are you going to support snow? And if they are, all these other cards get kind of weirdly warped. And so that's a particular mechanic that doesn't really jive with the community super well.
Yeah, I also think generally a lot of the people that have power optimized environments are just not as excited about this set because they don't see a huge number of standouts.
As our listener said in their hot take, which I played earlier, nothing for power focused cubes apparently.
My favorite quote,
except for Usher.
My favorite quote is, "Kaldheim is honestly the set that broke me." Apparently this person followed MTG and then saw Kaldheim for their cube with all of the cards and their complexity and we're just like, I'm off it.
They don't sound too off it if they're spending time to fill out our survey.
That's true.
You know what? I'm done being engaged with Magic. Now let me fill out this survey and very specifically rate all of these cards for this hyper-specific format for this one website. I feel you, listener. I'm sorry that Jett loved that you were broken by it. He's a sick man. You hear we wanted to kill that cat earlier? Disgusting stuff.
This is propaganda.
All right, we gotta close it there. This has been a long one. I gotta edit it in like the next 48 hours. It's gonna be great. This has been Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for listening. Thank you all for sending in your survey submissions. We are very grateful that we get to perform this role for the community of capturing the initial sentiment about cards. I see all the time on Reddit, somebody pops in and posts like, oh, I've been deployed and I haven't been looking at Magic for 18 months. What did I miss? And immediately people are sending them links to all the old Cube perspectives, and that feels great. So thank you all for helping us make this. It's a real thrill. Thank you to James Nassi for producing all of our music, and thank you to both Anthony and Jett for talking about Magic with me for 2 hours and 42 minutes.
Always happy to do this.
Anytime. You know, I just realized one of our favorite phrases can apply very nicely to Magic card design. We could say, I didn't have time to design you a simple Magic card, so I designed you a complicated one.
Hey, Andy and Anthony, thanks so much for your content. You're definitely my #1 favorite shower podcast.